My name is Billy Garrett. I'm the interim director for the New Mexico History Museum. I want to welcome you to the History Museum. I've been on the job for all of 6 months, and one of the first things that crossed my desk was, well, what about the Harvey weekend? And so we got together, and this is a special event for the New Mexico History Museum. We've got support for this particular event through the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. I want to thank them for their help. And although the lectures are free, the dinner, there is a cost for that. And any proceeds, any net proceeds, go to benefit the programs here at the museum. And we deeply appreciate that because this museum, unlike some, is a public-private partnership, basically. The state pays for the building and the staff, but all the programs, all the exhibitions come from donors, supporters, contributions, grants, anything we can do to help make money to keep history alive in New Mexico for you, for visitors, for the communities of New Mexico. So I want to thank you for being here. Special thanks to Stephen Fried. I think he's supposed to be the chief Fred head. And one of the things we did this year was we did a contract with Stephen for him to coordinate the entire event. He's done a spectacular job doing that. We want to thank Stephen very much for the work.
And blame me for everything.
I want to thank Jenny Kimball, right here from La Fonda. She's been integral to the support for this event. Of course, Chef Johnny V has been very much involved in helping set up the dinner for tomorrow. And then I want to thank Jamie Clements and Yvonne Montoya from the Museum of New Mexico Foundation for their help in keeping all this stuff going together. And last but not least, I want to thank all the staff from the New Mexico History Museum for their participation and help in, this is not normal, everyday kind of thing we do here, but it is part of what we are working toward, is to have more activities here, and that just means we got to stretch, because we're understaffed, but we've got a great staff. So I just want to thank you, shout out to the folks, and in particular, we've got some security guys here to help. The two most common questions I get are where are the elevators and where are the restrooms? If you're on this lower level and you want to just be able to walk out to an elevator, you can go through this opening here, right out to the double doors, and there's an elevator there that will take you to multiple levels. If you go through that door and around toward the staircase, you'll find the restrooms on the lower level. If you're on the upper section and you need to use the restrooms, just go out the doors to your left, down the staircase, and around to the right. So they're very conveniently located. We also have restrooms on the other floors, but none on the mezzanine level. And speaking of the mezzanine level, I just do want to mention that, of course, outside the doors up above, we have the Harvey Exhibit, fantastic exhibit. And there's a new part to this, what we call the Triangle Gallery, which is tucked in around the back side. There's an exhibition we just opened on the last Friday. It's called Working on the Railroad. It features photographs of men and women who worked on the railroads, specifically on the railroads. The photographs come from the Library of Congress, but the predominant number are actually from the photo archives here at the History Museum. They are spectacular, and there's a very nice narrative that goes along with those. So if you haven't seen that exhibit and you have a chance, stop by and take a look at that. And I hope you have a great time this weekend. I'll be with you the entire time. And with that,
There's a long history here of directors just pointing at me and telling me to start talking. Thank you, Billy. As he said, I mean, Billy was on the job for like 9 minutes when he had to make a decision about what we were doing with the Fred Head weekend this year. And I want to thank him, the staff here at the museum, the staff at the foundation, La Fonda and so many staff members at La Fonda have worked on this in so many different ways. The ads you saw in PASA were done by the marketing department at La Fonda. Everybody at La Fonda jumps in on this. And here, I'm actually going to advance the slide to tell you that the Fred Harvey History Weekend, or the Fredhead Weekend as we know it, was originally founded and presented by the museum and La Fonda Hotel, and this was 10 years ago. The first one of these was in April of 2010. Obviously, in recent years, we have added the Castaneda and the Plaza Hotels in Las Vegas, Legal Tender in Lamy, the Winslow Arts Trust, and Might Makes Right is my little and Diane's little LLC that oversees this. But it really has become sort of a statewide thing, which is what we dreamed of when we first started this, and it was like a joke almost that one day we would all be together and we would be having dinner at the Castaneda, and the Lamy operation would be reopened again, and Alan and Tina would cross the Arizona border into New Mexico. And the Arizona Fredheads and the New Mexico Fredheads could be as one. And so I think that really has happened. It's a wonderful thing. And so I'm also very pleased with the lineup of speakers we have this year. And I'm going to start my speech so that it can end at some point, and we can have everybody else talk. So I assume some of you have heard me talk about Fred Harvey before. But I assume there's probably some people who have not been to Fred Harvey events. We've actually had a lot of RSVPs from people who are Fred curious. For those of you who haven't heard the story, and I'll also try to give some updates for those of you who have. So the major question of my life over the last 10 or 15 years has been, who the hell is Fred Harvey? Especially for people in the East who only know about Howard Johnson. We don't know about Fred Harvey unless we go to the Grand Canyon and we get flyers about Fred Harvey, and we don't know what they are. So basically, Fred Harvey was a British guy. He came to America in 1853. He worked in restaurants in New York City. He co-owned a restaurant in St. Louis, which was undermined by the Civil War. His partner was a Southern sympathizer and left with all their money. Fred had married. He and his wife had 2 children. His wife died in childbirth in their second child. So Fred went from having a really nice business in St. Louis to losing his business, to losing his wife, and taking care of 2 babies. He moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, and then to Leavenworth, Kansas, remarried, and he got involved in the railroad business, in the transportation business, because that's where trains stopped. So the trains only went as far as the Missouri River at that time and then started to expand. So to be in transportation was to be in trains, to be in wagon trains, and to be in packet boats. That's how things moved along. And Fred's job was to be a ticket agent and then later to be a freight agent, so that as the railroads expanded west, he helped businesses move their stuff back to the east. And people didn't care that much about passengers then. We were just sort of a pain in the neck. I guess we are still kind of a pain in the neck. It is, as is our right. In the train business, the motto was "Freight doesn't complain." But the railroads, in order to get the land grants to build their tracks, had to take care of passengers, and that's where Fred Harvey came in. So Fred Harvey had a whole career, raised 5 kids in Leavenworth, Kansas, and then he had a midlife crisis in his early 40s and decided to get back in the restaurant business. And he saw that the railroads of the West did not have dining cars because the routes were too long, they were too expensive. So there were actually restaurants every 100 miles along the railroads. And these restaurants were uniformly horrible because they knew you were never going to come back. So you came, the food came really late, you took one bite of it, they blew the whistle, you got back on the train, and then they fed the thing to the next person. We actually found stories in the New York Times claiming that the food in the Western train restaurants was more dangerous than fires or train wrecks. And Fred Harvey's idea was that if one train company had better food, people would go on that train, on that route as opposed to other routes. And so he took a small contract to do this in Kansas and then expanded. He started in Topeka, Kansas, in this building up on the 2nd floor there. And he decided that even though this was just a wooden building that wasn't supposed to have very good food, that he would actually have great food, that he would have china, that he would have silver, that he would have fresh food brought in from Chicago, or wherever the train could go. This is actually one of Fred's notebooks with all the lists of, please turn your phones off, and I will too, of some of the things that Fred actually ordered into 1876 to set up this restaurant. And what's amazing is from this one restaurant, which was pretty modest, It mostly was great because you could get fresh meat there that was not scary to eat. And you could get fresh vegetables there, but the food was not very expansive to begin with. The company became this. Now, this may not seem like a lot of locations in a world of Starbucks and Walmarts and everything, but this is the first company in the world to ever have this many locations spread out in a country, and to actually confront the idea of how you run businesses like this in so many different places. And so the Harvey Company was known for its food, for its service, and for its processes, for its ability to be in business in so many places and have very high quality. But it started out pretty modestly. There were a lot of wooden train stations west of the Missouri River, and they just put dining rooms in them. And there were a couple larger buildings that existed. This is the one in Florence, Kansas. But they just took them over and did restaurants in them. They did a very beautiful dining room with, linen, silver, crystal. These were attached to, and in fact, this is the first menu for one of the high-end dining rooms in 1878. This was the first menu in Florence, Kansas, at the Clifton Hotel. A lot of lard those days on the food. There won't be using any lard at the foodie dinner tomorrow night. I can promise you that, unless the vegetarians want lard. Are there larditarians in the world? Anyway, so there's a main dining room. There's also sort of a prototype of the American diner where you had a la carte food, and then coffee. The most amazing thing about Fred Harvey, especially in the earliest times, the coffee in the West was horrible. People used to read it for days, months, and so the idea that you would have freshly made coffee that they wouldn't keep very long was really kind of an astonishing thing. I'm going to show you something that where is it? Oh, no. Oh, Jesus. I updated this. Okay. I'll show it to you later. We got recently from Trainiac an internal sheet from the company that describes like 10 different executives of the company and everything they had to say about every aspect of the coffee. So their commentary on the beans, and their commentary on the roast, and their commentary on the ground, and their commentary on the heating element, and their commentary on how long the coffee should sit before they threw it out, and what it should be reheated with. And so Byron Harvey, all yours great-grandfather, he had all his ideas. Victor Petroso, who ran the Grand Canyon operation, had all his ideas. And they had like 10 executives who I guess got together just to have this powwow. And the whole thing's printed out on a sheet like this big. Actually, we'll bring it here next year. So it was a small operation, a dining room, a diner, and takeout coffee. And Fred expanded the business. As I said, he had 5 kids with his second wife. This is his second wife, Barbara Sally Mathews. And they had 5 kids, a son, 3 daughters, and then another son. This is something that we haven't shown here before. We found an autograph book of one of Fred's daughters, May Harvey, and she brought it around in New Mexico during the early 1880s when the company was coming into New Mexico. So Fred wrote this: "My daughter May, be a good girl, and someday you will be a good woman. Your affectionate father, Fred H. Harvey, March 26th." And this is from her brother, your crass old brother, Ford Harvey. He was like about 14 when he wrote that. So the Harvey Company had a couple locations in Kansas, a couple locations in Colorado, and then they came full force into New Mexico. And New Mexico is really the turning point. It is so appropriate that Santa Fe and Las Vegas have become the heart and the center of Fred Harvey history, because the Fred Harvey Company, while it existed in Kansas and Colorado, really became itself in New Mexico. They opened 8 different locations very quickly when they only had 4 before, and they really came very fast. So they came into Raton, Las Vegas, Rincon, Las Cruces, San Marcial, before San Marcial washed away. Lamy, and these were all small locations except for the one in Las Vegas, which was the Montezuma Hotel. So the Montezuma, this is the original Montezuma, which burned down. They built 2 other ones afterwards. The Fred Harvey Company ran this, and the deal with the Fred Harvey Company was that it was a handshake deal for profits only. So the company, Fred Harvey only made money if there were profits. And so the problem with this hotel, it was very beautiful. It had amazing, it had a zoo outside where deer and antelope actually played. It had a casino. It had an amazing wine cellar. It was actually the largest Queen Anne wooden building in America. The problem was it was a health resort, and at that time, people who went to health resorts were actually really sick. So it wasn't like a wellness resort where you go to get more wellness. It's like where people with tuberculosis, and so the part of the problem, and you can read in the newspaper in Las Vegas, people were complaining, I just came here for a lovely thing. I saw like a guy without a nose. That's not my idea of a vacation. So in fact, this wonderful idea became highly unprofitable. And the people in Las Vegas were really unhappy when I told them that, in fact, Fred Harvey only ran the Montezuma for a year. And so this is, when you're a historian in this area, you are like the docent buster. And docents hate when someone writes a new book that makes them change their spiel. And so my Fred Harvey book, it was not a good thing. But people like knowing the truth. But what ended up happening was because Fred pulled away from the Montezuma, and because there was a racial incident in Raton, New Mexico during the same time when African-American waiters, who were the predominant waiters in New Mexico during that time, got into racial disputes with customers. I mean, it was very tense. A lot of the cowboy customers were former Southern sympathizers. They were really quite aggressive with the waiters, who often carried guns just to protect themselves while they were waiting. So after another racial incident at Raton, it was decided by Fred that they would replace all the African-American waiters in New Mexico with single women, and they would get them from the Midwest, and that's how the Harvey girls were born. And we believe that some of the Harvey girls were employees from the Montezuma after the Harveys left it. It's a little squishy, but we have pieced that together. But that is the beginning of the Harvey girls, and then from that point on, the Harvey girls, there were 100,000 Harvey girls from the 1880s through the 1940s. There were Harvey girls after that, but keep in mind, the original idea for the Harvey girls was that they would be hired centrally in the Midwest and trained centrally and then sent to all the different locations, because especially in the West, they didn't want to rely on just whoever was in town. So what finally happened in the 1930s and 1940s, one that you may have heard, there was a depression in the 1930s. That didn't help. But also there were enough people in these towns that they could hire locally. So there were Harvey girls up through the 1960s and 70s, but they were hired locally, whereas the original Harvey girls were trained and sent all over the country. So Fred Harvey, while he was the genius of this, actually ran it for a relatively short period of time because he had health problems. And so it wasn't too long where internally people were saying, who the hell are Ford Harvey and David Benjamin? Because Ford Harvey, Fred's son, got involved in the business pretty young because Fred was ill. And David Benjamin, who was Fred's right-hand man, he had been his accountant. He was a Jewish gentleman from London who worked in Leavenworth. And Ford and David Benjamin actually ran the company behind the scenes for a long time, with Fred still giving the ideas. And they ran a lot of it out of the original Union Depot in Kansas City. These are these coffee slides that I told you about. So if you look, this is Byron Harvey up in the upper left-hand corner. Please get away from the lights. Hello, upstairs. Please go around and not through. Okay, no one's listening. So that's Byron Harvey. And look at their description, halfway between pulverized and ordinary, pretty fine, like coarse granulated sugar. These are just guys sitting in a room debating every aspect of coffee. What kind of urn it should be in. They're just obsessed with this. The length of time, please stop walking in front of them. 2 hours in a house, 45 minutes in a dining car. But this is the attention to detail that they had. And as I said, the Harvey Company really came of age in New Mexico. The Montezuma was a mistake for them, a wonderful building, a wonderful business for the Santa Fe Railroad, but really taught the Harvey Company to be focused on these smaller restaurants, and they are where the Harvey girls were born. This is one of the earlier pictures we have of Harvey girls. There are Harvey girl pictures from all over. As someone mentioned earlier, Tom Gable, who was Fred Harvey's postman in Leavenworth, actually came up with the idea for the Harvey girls and suggested it to Fred in Raton. But by the time the Harvey girls were in place, Fred Harvey was not well. He had symptoms that we would now call depression. He had stomach issues that later became stomach and bowel cancer. but what was diagnosed at the time was that he had Americanitis, which was actually a pre-psychiatric disease. There are books written about it, and the cure was for him to go to England and be away from America. And so for that reason, his son, Ford, had to leave college and learn the business, and he learned the business from David Benjamin. And one of the reasons that I always try to point out the different characters in this, just as Arnold was doing, is that I think we tend to focus too much on Fred, like he did everything. And Fred did a lot of cool things. Fred was an amazing leader and had amazing ideas, but his real power was that he could create businesses where lots of people would do his bidding, lots of people would do perfect work and give perfect service in locations all over the country where he couldn't be. This was all run, as I said, out of Kansas City Union Station, and you can see at this point Fred's not a well guy, and he's spending at least half the year in England. This is in the 1880s. But the company is expanding. The railroad expands all the way to California. It becomes twice as big. All those restaurants get Harvey Girls. And then the company grows too big, the Santa Fe Railroad gets in trouble, and Fred Harvey is about to be fired. And this is the part of the story that they never tell in the Santa Fe Railroad version. But in fact, the Fred Harvey Company almost stopped in the late 1880s and in the early 1890s. It was saved in part because of the depression that was all around the white city of Chicago. So one of the things that Fred Harvey tried to do to save the company was to bid on the food service contracts for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 because he believed that the Santa Fe Railroad would finally get rid of him. They did not get that contract, and the Harvey Company was really just about at the end of its rope when the economy collapsed in 1893. The Santa Fe Railroad went bankrupt. All the other companies in America went bankrupt. And then the Santa Fe could not afford to fire Fred Harvey. So all the things that happened up until 1893 are a wonderful part of the early history of Fred Harvey. And we shouldn't confuse them with what happened later, much of which happened while Fred was dying and while the people who he had brought into the business, like his son, Ford, really did. So after the economy came back in the mid-1890s, it was then that the railroad decided that the Southwest was not just a place to go over, not just the flyover states to get to California, but in fact could be a business in and of itself. The fact that we're sitting here in this room in a city like Santa Fe shows that they were right. And so they changed what they were doing. They also added dining cars to the business. They started adding what were called union stations. Of course, at this time, there were no union stations in the country. Every city had an individual station for each railroad. So Fred Harvey made a deal to take over St. Louis Union Station, which I actually just spoke there 2 weeks ago. They are getting together their Harvey Girl thing. So St. Louis has never paid attention to this, but now they are starting to do it because the people who own the hotel, it's a Hilton, are really into the Harvey Girls. Actually, Jenny and I were there. Their food was pretty good, right? Yeah. And they had Harvey Girl outfits, and we're trying to get them interested. So they started being in union stations. They began in the retail business, which they had not been in before, because the union stations, when they took them over, meant they could run the bookstore, they could run the clothing store, they could run 4 or 5 different restaurants. And so they had to learn that business. And then finally, they decided that in the Southwest, they would build resort hotels. And part of the reason that we think it's so cool the Castaneda is coming back is because there's absolutely no question that the Castaneda was the beginning of the Santa Fe Railroad idea that the Southwest would turn into what it turned into. Someplace that people would come and really get an understanding of America at a much different level than they ever had before. And this was the first mission-style hotel that they built here. It was finished in 1898. It became famous in 1899 because the railroad convinced Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders to have their reunion there. It was just like a business deal, a way to get national attention, to get the national press to come to little Las Vegas, New Mexico, and pay attention to the Santa Fe's new strategy. We actually don't know how active Fred was in all this kind of stuff because Fred was at this point really sick. He had surgery in England. He came back from England and was basically looking at doctors to try to save him. The relationship between him and Ford during this time is really interesting. It's like any father and son where the father wants to try every crackpot treatment there is, and the son's like, is this really going to do anything? Their letters back and forth are so powerful. And while it's happening, the company's expanding. Fred dies in 1901. The company finishes the Alvarado at Albuquerque. And right after it's finished, Ford comes here, and all the Santa Fe Railroad brass come to the Alvarado, and they take a train ride through what will be the tourist Southwest. And they stop at all the Native American pueblos, which have seen very few white people. And they get an idea of what this could all be if more people could come, if there was a way to do it so the Native Americans were being respected. And I mean, they were doing this in business with the Navajo Nation, with the Hopi Nation, who helped them go to all these places. There's actually other pictures of this scene, like hundreds of Native Americans rode with these executives out into the Pueblos to sort of show them what was going on in them. They ended up at the Grand Canyon. This is the first train to the Grand Canyon. And they sat at the edge of the Grand Canyon trying to figure out what the future would be for the canyon. That's Ford on the left, Charles Loomis on the right. They didn't realize that the Grand Canyon would be the cornerstone of the future of the Fred Harvey Company, because after Grand Canyon was open, Grand Canyon was so much bigger than everything else in Fred Harvey, it's really hard to imagine. This is also when Ford's sister Minnie Huckle and her husband John, who was a retail expert from New York, got more involved in the business, moved to Kansas City. And so retail became a bigger part of it. And Minnie Huckle and her husband were big collectors. They were the people from the family who first came to Santa Fe and shopped at all these shops and brought home all the cool stuff. And they were hoping their brother might get into this. And when he came back from this train trip, he decided, and they decided together, that they would make Native American art more part of what they did. They were going to create a Native American art museum. They weren't really sure they were going to sell it. They were going to create a museum. And it was very clear that the future of what their business was going to be was explaining to people the real story of the Southwest, the multicultural story of the Southwest, that really was not known to people. So people give Fred Harvey credit for explaining America to Americans, which is true. But the Harvey Company also explained the diverse nature, especially of this part of the country, to people in a way that otherwise would not have happened. And it was a combination of the Huckles and the other Harvey family members, Mary Colter coming in, being brought in first to do the interior design on the Indian Room at the Alvarado, later other jobs. Herman Schweitzer, who was their buyer in the Native American art market, little Jewish guy who had started out selling oranges on the trains and became somebody who would ride out into the reservations and buy his own jewelry and also give Native Americans lighter silver and smaller stones so they would make more commercial jewelry. Which might sound bad, but at the same time, he also made sure that everything they made that was art and everything that they had that was art was preserved. So they created the Indian Building, which we always see pictures of today. And the Indian Building was at the Santa Fe Railroad stop at the Alvarado and was where so many Americans found out about Native American life. A couple years later, the entire thing was recreated at the Grand Canyon. They built El Tovar. That's where I always sit when I go to El Tovar. Although I will say, isn't it amazing that they never wanted to put a fence around? I mean, I'm glad they didn't, but it really is astonishing there's no fence around the Grand Canyon, isn't there? These are pictures of El Tovar at the time. And then, of course, Hopi House. And Hopi House was a bigger version of the Indian Building. Not only was it an Indian building, but Indians lived in the building. And whereas the Indian Building in Albuquerque was more Navajo, this was more Hopi. And people lived in it, they created art, they did dances there. And the company grew unbelievably quickly during this time period under Ford Harvey. And Ford had his maxims for businessmen, which he brought together from his dad's old maxims. One of the things that I always thought was interesting was he talked about being committed to complete customer satisfaction, hold consistently to a level of theoretical perfection, he wrote. Because he realized that you couldn't say the customer is always right if the customers didn't have the slightest idea what they needed at the lip of the Grand Canyon. You couldn't wait for them to figure out what they needed at the lip of the Grand Canyon. You actually had to guess that yourself. They also promoted from within. And Fred's classic line, always please the cranks. Never take yourself too damn seriously. And then during this time period in the early 1900s, the company expanded hugely. First into Kansas City Union Station. Ironically, since the company was based in Kansas City, it had never had a restaurant there. So for 30 years it was in Kansas City, you could never eat at a Fred Harvey restaurant. But in 1914, they took over the entire Kansas City Union Station. This is also the time when Ford got very involved in the creation of the National Park Service. I mean, the Park Service was mostly interested in trees. Ford was the one who really had experience taking care of people in the Park Service. They really turned to the Fred Harvey Company for their knowledge of how to take care of people in the parks, which involved not only people who were hikers, who understood how to take care of themselves in the wilderness, but people like me and my wife who never want to get off the front porch of El Tovar, but want to think of that as being exotic and outdoorsy. the turning point for all this turned out to be the 1915 World's Fair. No one had planned this. No one could have known that there would be a world war by the time the World's Fairs in California and San Diego would take place, and because of that, no one could go to Europe. But those World's Fairs were the turning point for Southwest tourism because people poured into the West to go to California, and then they poured to the Grand Canyon. They came into New Mexico as well. And we're having a talk tomorrow with Maria Martinez's great-granddaughter. This is when Maria Martinez became known to the Fred Harvey Company. She and her husband made black-on-black pottery at the San Diego World's Fair with them. So these two World's Fairs were hugely important. And after them and after the First World War, there were ideas about what the company should do, and also the next generation was coming in. So Ford Harvey, keep in mind there are 5 Harvey kids. Ford has 2 kids, the 3 daughters don't have kids, and Byron is much younger. He's just getting his feet wet in the business. Ford's kids, Frederick, who's a World War I flyer and wants the company to get more involved in the airlines, in car business. His sister Kitty, who's an amazing art collector, openly gay woman, one of the only openly gay women in her time period, and wants to be involved in the business. And they're watching it expand. They take over Chicago Union Station, which used to have a big Fred Harvey banner on the side. And then, not too long after, they had a plan. People always say, well, why do people let a company like this that was so tied to the railroads die with the railroads? The Harvey Company actually did not do that. Other things happened. They actually had a master plan that would go on beyond the railroads because the railroad companies would not invest in the next technologies. They did not invest in cars. They did not invest in planes. They believed their business was trains. But the Harvey Company did not believe that, especially Freddie Harvey. Route 66 ran along the Santa Fe Railroad, so they were already serving people in cars. Those cars went very slowly and broke down all the time. It is amazing people even bothered to drive them. I will say that one of my favorite images of Fred Harviness is in the early years of the Grand Canyon. No one wanted to drive to the Grand Canyon. They would bring their cars on the trains to the Grand Canyon so they could then drive them back and forth along the lip of the Grand Canyon and take them home. But the company was feeding people in cars. They were investing in Southwest tourism, which is when they came into Santa Fe. Santa Fe was the last major city in the Southwest that they came into. They all stayed here all the time. They all bought stuff here all the time, but it wasn't on the main line of the train. In the 1920s, they created the Indian Detours, and they took over La Fonda and built up a tourism business here. While the tourism business itself only lasted a few years, what's really interesting about it is it really did lay the groundwork for our understanding of the multicultural Southwest. The writing that was done under the Fred Harvey auspices, that Mary Colter and others signed, really is the cornerstone of us seeing the way the Southwest is for real. And there's wonderful pictures. And at the same time, they were in the airline business. So Freddie Harvey wanted to be in the first cross-country airline business. He partnered with Charles Lindbergh, with Henry Ford, with many others, to create a business that you would fly during the day, take the train at night, and for this reason, you could get across the country in only 3 days, as opposed to the much longer time it took. And this airline became TWA, but that happened later. Freddie Harvey, of course, was in charge of the food. These planes were little. They were not pressurized. The windows opened. So trying to figure out what food you can serve when the windows are open and your ears are bleeding, and there were a lot of mixed metaphors. They didn't want to just come out and say we have to give people food that won't make them throw up. But it was a job. The original stewards were male, and then they realized they should be women. So that's how stewardesses came into being. They sort of modeled the Harvey girls. And so by the end of the 20s, the Fred Harvey Company was poised to take over the whole world. They could easily have moved west. There were stories in the paper about how they might extend to Grand Central Station and to New York. They were already in Cleveland. They had these huge operations. They were in the cross-country transport business. And then Ford Harvey got a cold, and he died in 6 days. And the family was not prepared for his death the way they had been prepared for Fred's death. And there was a big scramble. His kids inherited all the stock in the company, but his brother Byron, who had been waiting for his chance to run the company, wanted to know why he couldn't be in charge. He had been working in Chicago, mostly with the dining car business. Their sister Minnie got caught in the middle of all this. She and her attack dogs tried to keep things at bay. And so things started changing in the business. Interestingly, Texas and Oklahoma, all those places, stopped being Fred Harvey at this point. but they kept wearing the clothes and serving the food, so nobody noticed. But the Frisco Railroad, that deal was a separate deal, and in the early 1930s, they got out of all of those. It's too bad because some of the pictures from the Frisco, I must say, are wonderful. But they still continue to invest in the company. They built La Posada after the Depression had started. They let Mary Colter finish it, even though it was unbelievably expensive. We have actually now some of her books with the fabrics from it that are at the Hearst Museum. And the railroad also let her build the Desert Watchtower at the Grand Canyon. What an incredible extravagance to build in the mid-1930s when tourism is almost at a standstill. Thank God these things got made. This is also when Membreno China was created. You'll all be getting some Membreno China if you're joining us for dinner tomorrow night, to be served on the Super Chief. Bright Angel Lodge was created during this time. And things were going really well, and then Ford Harvey's son, who was a flyer, died in a plane crash. And at this point, the Ford Harvey part of the company stopped controlling the company. The Kansas City Harveys stopped being in control of the company, and the Chicago Harveys became more dominant. The Chicago Harveys were closer to the railroad than the Kansas City Harveys had been. The Kansas City Harveys were the ones who were trying to diversify the company. And so the Chicago Harveys, who ran an amazing business, it was just a different business. In order to do that, they had to buy out Kitty Harvey, who owned all the stock. And there were many people who felt that Kitty Harvey, a Harvey girl, should own the company, and it should stay in Kansas City. People in Kansas City just wanted the company to stay there. Instead, it ended up being taken over by Byron Harvey Sr. and his 3 sons. Now, every Harvey you see here is a Byron Harvey descendant, because the other Harvey lines did not continue. Freddie Harvey and his wife did not have kids. Kitty Harvey was gay. The 3 daughters didn't have children. So everybody emanates from this part of the family, which took over the business in the late 30s and ran it very successfully for the next 30 or 40 years. They expanded into LA Union Station. Tomorrow we will have Said Moses here talking about saving this room, which so many of us for years have been begging for somebody to save. I mean, the fact that we would have the Castaneda and a restaurant in this room now is something that would have been unimaginable a number of years ago. Company contracted. It was brought back to some degree because the Second World War allowed all the old Harvey girls to get their jobs back and all the buildings to reopen. That's why the Harvey Girls movie got made, because the company was so big at that time. And we're going to hear actually some Harvey Girl-inspired music in a second when I stop talking about this. But after the 1940s, the company contracted. As you can see, most of it was in the Southwest, so it's appropriate that we continue to focus on the Southwest because the parts of it that were in the Midwest got smaller. The company bought El Tovar in the 1950s. They bought La Fonda. That's the reason why they continue to hold those properties, why the Xanterra has to own them. This is La Fonda during the 60s. But it was started getting bleak, as Mary Colter pointed out, as she watched her buildings being shuttered down. You know, it is possible to live too long. And she did not live to see this, luckily, to see the Alvarado knocked down, a horrible, painful sight, almost as painful as some of the facial hair that was seen at La Fonda and other places, at the handful of places that were still Fred Harvey. Now, the Harvey Company by the mid-'70s did not own these anymore. They had sold out to a large conglomerate, but the family still felt great affection for it, and the people who worked at them who loved Fred Harvey referred to themselves as Fred heads. So I will say that when I first thought of the word Fred head, I thought I made it up because, as you know, I have a second career making up words. But then I realized that, in fact, Fred head had been a very common term at the Grand Canyon because deadheads had made T-shirts like this. And also I met somebody online today who said they also referred to it as Camp Fred, that the Grand Canyon was referred to as Camp Fred. And what happened basically is while the Harvey Company, as we know it, stopped existing, people who loved the art, who loved all the different access points that the Harvey Company gives you, culinary, visual, architectural, cultural, they started getting more involved. The art collection went to the Hearst Museum. Maureen McMillan, who is right here. Maureen, put your hand up. Maureen McMillan in Belen was the first of the local people to say, we have to save this building and do something with it to honor what it was. The Belen Harvey House, I mean, ironically, there's nothing in Albuquerque, and you have the Belen Harvey House right nearby. Maureen was the first. Alan and Tina then bought La Posada. brought it back to life, and also brought the idea back to life that these buildings and this whole legacy could be alive. This was not popular at La Fonda at the time. It became more popular when Jenny got more involved and more control. Thank goodness. I would say it was not the previous owner's fault. They had a little falling out with the Harveys, and I will say that part of the downside of the Harveys when the companies were sold was that the companies that bought them thought that they were buying more than they got. And so there was a little bit of bitterness. And so what you heard Billy talk about in the 80s, no one cared about making sure those Harvey buildings were preserved, is because there was an essential bitterness, and people did not yet really sort of understand that the next generation of this was going to be to preserve this and get past the fact of how the company was sold out. So this was happening in all these different cities, and then I wrote a book. And this is a picture of the talk that I gave here in Santa Fe 10 years ago. So some of you who are here know that when my book on Fred Harvey came out, the cornerstone talk of our entire train tour was here in this building. It had just opened, and the power went out in the building. We thought we blew a fuse, and then we realized the power had gone out in all of Santa Fe. And so we did the whole thing in the dark. Natalie Bontomasi had a Lego flashlight in her pocketbook, which I did my talk with, sort of campfire style. And I think that was really the beginning of how special this was all going to be for the Southwest and how special it was for us. I remember well going to the Castaneda with the thought that, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if one day we were all actually going there like for dinner, like we're going to do Sunday night. A lot of the people here in this audience were there. And so the weekends that we're doing have gotten more and more interesting each year, I hope. Last year, CBS Sunday Morning was here and did a whole show on the weekend. And go. Oh, this is like a big, heavy picture. Go ahead. You can do it. Cool. So what I wanted to finish up saying is this. First of all, the part of what is cool about this whole thing is just the romance of it for everybody and the love of it. And I will admit, my wife and I started coming here to the Southwest in the fall because it was our anniversary. And so we came here for many anniversaries, and some would argue that the only reason I agreed to do a book on Fred Harvey was so we could continue coming here for our anniversary. There are not, some years that your anniversary isn't so romantic. We spent our anniversary today at 3 o'clock in the morning in the Dallas airport, hoping that we would get here in time for this. But what I want to say is we know a lot of people, we've met a lot of people who we are friends with and who really feel close with because of this. And I think that that is part of the legacy of the Harvey revival too. It's not just buildings, it's not just amazing food, it's also people who have a real respect for each other, real interest in each other. You know, we live in Philadelphia, but we consider the Southwest like our second home because of this. And I think a lot of people do, and I think, but a lot more people need to know about this. It is amazing how many we get here, but you know, the number of people who've never heard of Fred Harvey, like these guys talked about today, is astonishing. And every time someone hears the story, they're like, why didn't I know this? How could this have happened in America? How could this have been this popular, and I didn't know this? That is the essence of great history. You know, to be able to bring something back that when you hear about it, you say like, wow, I should have known about this. And it really allows me to appreciate it better. So I think we're really just starting here. We're appreciating 10 years. I hope we're here another 10 years and many more, saving more buildings and doing more of these weekends. And I'm going to stop my slides here and turn over to the next thing, but I did want to finish up. So thank you for giving me the time and for allowing me to do this. And that's that. Okay, I would like to invite Arnold Berke, Barbara Felix, and Billy Garrett up. Billy? Who's waving their hand? Oh, they'll sell them in. Thanks. Family members always have to. Yes, they sell them in the. They sell them in the gift shop here at the museum and at Detours at La Fonda. Where is Billy? We can start without him. Because he's third. He's third. Are you guys ready up there? Okay. So as a lot of you know, there's two great anniversaries this year in Fredheadism. One is the 100th anniversary of the creation of Grand Canyon National Park, which actually happened really late in the overall scheme of things because of politics at the Grand Canyon. I actually hope one day that we have a presentation here just about that, because it's actually unbelievably ugly, unbelievably interesting. It went to the Supreme Court. It's quite a saga. And the other is Mary Colter's 150th birthday. And as some of you know, while this weekend started with me giving a talk about my book, it actually expanded into what all this is because we did a Mary Colter weekend when Barbara and Jenny were working on the first round of renovations at La Fonda, trying to make all those what would Mary do decisions. And so, you know, what happens is history remains static until there's a need for it to become alive again. So when you write a book, you have to make it come alive again. When you're restoring a building, you have to make it come alive again. So we did a weekend there, and that really was, I have to say, the turning point in all this. The reason we have all these lectures now is because we brought people to Santa Fe. We did multiple lectures. We did them mostly at La Fonda, I think, if I remember. And that was really the pattern for this, and then it sort of grew and grew and grew. So what we wanted to do was have, you know, you can't, Mary Colter is both too vast to get your head around, but at the same time, somebody who we know like awfully little about for somebody that we care about this much. And so I wanted to bring together first Arnold Berke, who wrote the authoritative biography on Mary Colter, who we haven't had here in a really long time, and we're so happy that he is back. Thank you, Arnold. It's great to see you. And Barbara Felix. Billy, if you could come in. Barbara Felix, who is obviously a wonderful architect here in Santa Fe and has been involved in a number of Colter-related projects, especially around La Fonda, but I think also just really has brought enormous energy to the story over the years. And Billy said, you know, I would be a good panelist for this, and I didn't really know why. I mean, I knew he had been the National Park Service's historical architect. No, I mean, because I met Billy because he was in charge of the museum. But then we had this amazing conversation, which I don't want to tell you about because he can tell you about it, about his involvement at the Park Service and at the Grand Canyon during really incredibly formative and important years when some of the Colter buildings at the Grand Canyon could easily have been lost. And so we don't know about that so much. And the other thing that I got, which is really cool, Mike Quinn, our friend at the Grand Canyon, made us a film. So this is every bit of visual film that exists on Mary Colter. Some of them you may have seen. Okay. Some of them you may have seen, but others not. Let me see how I do this. Do I just...
The video is not in the PowerPoint. So if we exit out of it and go back to that folder, it's in that folder.
It's in the PowerPoint.
It was given to us on the thumb drive as a separate video.
Okay, so where is it? Okay. This is Mary offering a smoke to a Harvey car sun shield. This is Mary driving a Harvey car. I think a road might have been a better idea. I mean, it's so cool to be able to see this. In a way, it's almost like we have more video of her than we do of still pictures. There's just not that many still pictures of Mary. Just happened to be some musicians wandering by.
I have to follow that. That would be a good comment. Yeah. A little bit close there.
This is, I think, up on the top of the watchtower when they were still building it. She's telling me, put that rock there. That's it. Now we're going to pick up and Arnold is going to show us his slides. Here's this will advance it for you.
Okay, talk before I.
You can talk.
Sure.
You do whatever you want. Your slides are ready. You can be up here if you'd rather.
Yeah, why not? But who could follow Mary Colter like that? One suggestion, if we have Fred heads, is it? We should have Mary Mavens. That'll be the next.
I like that.
Yeah. First, I'd like to begin with the 150th sort of honor by sharing some very good news, which is that the restoration of the murals that Mary Colter commissioned for the tower at Desert View at Grand Canyon have been restored. So, those of you who have visited there before the restoration, actually a conservation they call it, knew how bad it had gotten over more than, I guess, 8 decades of existence through water and human interaction, to be nice about it. So, yeah, a lot of graffiti. So this is, to me, great news because when I was doing the book, it was in its sort of wilderness years and looked really pretty bad. And also, I've been told the kiva in the front through which you enter to go into the tower has been cleared of much or maybe all of its merchandise, so you can actually go in and see the architecture of the room and the intent, and the stories that she intended and the Park Service intended to be told through this wonderful space. So I have to go back there and see that. Now, the 150th of Colter's birthday has prodded me to look back on my research, all those many files. Research I did for the book, and research I did that sort of accumulates. After you do a book, it keeps coming in, right, Fred? Freed? Stephen? So much Fred here, I called you Fred. And that prompted me to think about, to get back into doing research to bring the story up to date, some of which I may be doing. And especially am interested in the people that Colter worked with, either on projects or the people she knew socially, that she knew professionally, and to get more information on her interaction with those people to help build up the record for Mary Colter, but also to find out more about these people in and of themselves, because these are really interesting people, very, very varied. So I'm just going to go through a little list of the ones that I've picked here. The first is Erna Ferguson. Who here has heard of Erna Ferguson? Okay. Well, most people nowadays, especially throughout the country, have never heard of her, which is very sad because she was a brilliant writer on, can't call her a travel writer, she was a travel essayist, a cultural travel writer essayist, to put it all together, who did incredible books on the Southwest. First one of which I encountered in doing my research on the book, for the book, was called Our Southwest, which I think is her most famous book, after the book she did called Dancing Gods. Okay. These were books that were published by Alfred Knopf in New York. They were really high-quality books with high-quality photographs, and to my knowledge have fallen out of renown ever since. And they've never been reprinted. Now, I'd love to be corrected on that, but I would really love to find out more about her life, which, as you know, includes being a tour leader. She founded the Kosher Tours, which led later on to the famous Harvey Indian Detours. So she was a writer, business leader, all sorts of things wrapped into one woman, into this one Albuquerque native. The next person I want to mention is the person I call Colter's sort of pal, who is Herman Schweitzer. Together, they did a lot of travel and research in working on what these projects would become in terms of the hotels, the stores, the shops, all sorts of things. And of course, Herman Schweitzer, you all know as the marketing genius of the Fred Harvey Company. And I thought that there's really three of these people, sort of the fearsome trio, which would be Colter, Herman Schweitzer, and then Minnie Huckle. And I sort of, in my own way, regard them as like the genus of the look of Harvey and the look of what they offered to the public, those three people. Then there's a man I call the polymath of the parks, Jesse Nussbaum, who seemed, as I was doing the research, to pop up everywhere. And I thought, you have to stay on a linear track when you're doing a book, and I thought I've got to get back to this guy. He was a superintendent of Mesa Verde for many years, and I believe headed the laboratory of archaeology. Do I have that right? Or anthropology? Over anthropology. So I would love to find out more about him. One architect, Louis Curtis, who I'd never heard of before I started reading about L. Ortiz, the cute little, what do they call it, the little boy of the Harvey system, unfortunately torn down. And I found out in my initial research that he was an amazing architect who designed in many different styles, not just mission / Southwestern, but Viennese style, modernism. He did the country's and perhaps the world's first curtain glass structure, which still stands in Santa Fe. Just an amazing man. I thought somebody needs to do a biography of Louis Curtis, and it hasn't happened yet. Arthur Mathews, who was Mary Colter's teacher when she went to the California School of Design in San Francisco, back in the height of the arts and crafts movement. He is the one who did the famous portrait of Mary Colter, the oil portrait that was only discovered maybe about 25 years ago, and rests at or is shown at the Northern Arizona Museum. He did it of Mary and signed it to my friend Mary E.J. Colter when she was his student at this school. And there's a lot out there to learn about Arthur Mathews. Laura Gilpin, I think, most of you would know that name. I sort of started to learn about her when I did my book, and now I'm really sort of very, very interested in finding out more about Laura Gilpin and how she interacted with Colter, and how she and Colter might have done the Santa Fe scene. It gets back to the Santa Fe end of Colter's life. In D.C., there was an exhibit of Laura Gilpin in her photographs in friendship with Maria Martinez that was held at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. So if that ever comes out here, it's a wonderful subject. And then as a subject, the artists, the various artists she worked with or commissioned for her interiors, including Fred Geary, Olive Rush, and Gerald Cassidy, and there's many more. I'd like to find out more about their interactions, what are the files out there about those interactions. And then finally the archaeologists, including some women archaeologists, two of whom were good friends of Colter. They were, okay, Harriet Cosgrove and Marjorie Ferguson Lambert. And then there are two topic areas I would love to continue researching, which are Mary growing up and Mary going to school and going off to California and coming back to St. Paul and immersing herself in the arts and crafts movement and everything that meant in architecture and in interiors. And then doing this wonderful quote. She spoke often to local industrial education groups and arts and crafts groups in St. Paul and in Minneapolis. And this one, just I or somebody discovered it recently, but it's her thoughts on art, and they're really wonderful. Well, it highlighted some of them, but you can read, artists develop themselves. There is no necessity of seeking for art genius. Trying to do for one's self is the surest way of learning to appreciate the work of others. And that's just sort of one of the best. There are very few quotes from Mary Colter, so that's one of the best. And in preparing for the 150 commemoration, I also just created a sort of a grab bag of slides that illustrate some of this research I'd like to do, or just some things that illustrate Mary. And let's hope this works. Okay. I click on something, right? Oh. No. Okay. Yeah. Okay, here are about 6 slides to explain in a little background. To prepare for designing the watchtower, the Desert View, she created a little group of Harvey people and hangers-on and drivers and Herman Schweitzer, and they went out and visited and documented and photographed their way through Mesa Verde, Hovenweep, Chaco, Bonito, other places, and came up with a wonderful sort of an Ansel Adams level photographic record. Many of them taken by Colter, some of them I think by other folks that's still to be researched. But for each of the ones she brought back, she put her stamp on the bottom, you can see there. This, I believe, is in Chaco, and I believe you would not do it nowadays. Concrete on the top has been removed.
Where is it? Mesa Verde?
Oh, that's Mesa Verde? Okay. And I don't know if the concrete oozing over the top is still there, but probably shouldn't be. Mary Colter again down in the left-hand corner. This is, I don't know, it could be Chaco or, which is where? Okay, so it's still at Mesa, okay. Okay, good to have a knowledgeable audience. This is Hovenweep. Yes? And a group of this group of people resting at Mesa Verde after doing, tromping around, everybody back then wore boots. Everybody had to wear heavy boots. And you look at these old photos, they were like outfitted at Abercrombie and Fitch in New York, because you're going to the West, So, but this I found very relaxing. First I thought that woman there was Mary, but it's not. So to be further, researched again. There's her stamp again in the left. And the best of this little collection I've come up with is Herman Schweitzer, obviously posing. Here I am going up at Mesa Verde to something in search of God knows what, but he was probably thinking, how can I, make this into something Fred Harvey could market, which was his job. So I really have to find out more about Herman. I did, in just one of these little side research things, found pictures of the houses he lived in Albuquerque, which is not like earth-shattering, but if anybody's interested, I've got them. Now, leaving this research trip, these are a couple of the many books that Mary bought, or more likely had Fred Harvey Company buy for her, that she used to research her designs, her architecture, her interiors. And I went through the whole lot of them when I was researching at Mesa Verde. They're still, or they were then, in the library. And on each one, she wrote her name. Actually, these, she bought all those, so they were hers to write her name in, to stick paper clips in and slightly abuse. But they were of these wonderful themes: Mexican houses, architectural details of Spain and the Mediterranean, and they go on and on and on, and wonderful publishing companies that are long gone, like the Architectural Book Publishing Company. There's one that's not here that's called Quivira, if anybody's ever heard of that. You have? Okay. Out of somewhere in California, but they're just stacks of them, and I just, had to tear myself away from this stack of Mary Colter owned books because it was 5 o'clock and they kick out researchers. Here's a little grab baggy thing. When I interviewed the woman who was named for Mary Colter, who was the daughter of a pupil of Mary Colter's in the high school in St. Paul, if you're still with me, his name was Larkin. His daughter was named after Mary. Her name was Mary Colter Larkin Smith. And I interviewed her in 1999, and she said, "You got to see all the gifts that Aunt Mary has given me." And I think also some of the ones that came to Mary Colter Larkin Smith after Mary Colter died. And what's interesting is it's not like a completely dominated by Southwestern or Mexican art. There's a lot of Asian and Chinese artifacts in there. And she, in her digs, in her apartments in Kansas City, collected a lot of Asian and including Chinese art. So it wasn't, if you went to her place, I was told, it wasn't like a replica of a Harvey House. So she probably wanted to get away from that complete look at home. Little fun thing I found. Somehow Hedda Hopper found Mary. This is from a Hedda Hopper little short stub of a gossip column in 1944. And you can see at the top, Paul Williams, who, by the way, has been rediscovered as one of the architects of Hollywood houses, who somehow, though African-American, enjoyed a very prosperous career and was really at the top of architects, designing what they would call Hollywood Regency style. If you ever want to just, Google this guy, he did incredible stuff. So he was at this party, somebody named Dora Auger, and decorator, and Mary Jane Colter, architect and decorator for Santa Fe at Paul Graynard's cocktail party. And on it goes, and it was, House Beautiful, but in 1944. So why she was there in 44, I'm not sure. I think she was on the verge of trying to sell the house she owned with her late sister near Pasadena, in Altadena. So that's my guess. So it's just a little Maryism. And I think my favorite picture of Mary Colter Now, all these images I've been showing you were not in my book, except for half of this one. Oh, no, sorry, always. Anyway, this is a lead into the picture I will show you. This is the original setup, the display cases of her jewelry that she bequeathed to Mesa Verde. It's not in this fashion now. I understand it's been changed, broken up, reduced, but this was back in the 50s. Here's the photo. And for my book, we had limited space and wanted to focus this image on Mary Colter. So we cropped it. And so what you see in the book is just Mary fingering her jewels and her hand down there. And the woman to the left is not in the photo, so sorry to this woman. But that woman is one of the archaeologists I mentioned before, Mary Ferguson Lambert, who I did a little research on recently, and she was one of the great women archaeologists in the region. So it came full circle. I like this especially because Mary has her mouth open and she's probably expounding on the meaning of whatever she's, holding on to there to this other person. And when you hear about Mary at parties, she either, if you were interested in what she was showing you, that's fine. If you weren't, she would banish you. So this is sort of and this was taken at a party showing all the jewelry and basketry, et cetera, she had just bequeathed to Mesa Verde. And it was held at the Laboratory of Anthropology that had just been opened, I believe, because this would have been about 1955 or 6, and it was designed by John Gall Meem. And I'm not sure of the room, but I would guess it's in the big auditorium room there. So I leave you with that.
Okay, Barbara is going to go next, and after, are you going to set it up? Go ahead. No, hers.
Okay.
I can get there. I'm starting with a blank screen. Partly because I love that Stephen considers me the Colter expert, because there's so little to know about Colter from an architectural point of view. There's not a lot of drawings. I'm not sure there's some drawings, but not a lot of drawings. There's not a lot of pictures. There's some photos. I'm not going to say I've made this woman whole cloth, but I'm passionate about this woman because I think she has a right to be who she is, and I think she's an architect. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So, basic. At a very basic level, an architect is somebody who draws, designs, constructs a building, coordinates a building. That's what we do, right? For almost all of time, an architect has actually been a master builder. The irony of a master builder is in Europe, if you get your architecture degree, you are still considered a master builder. In the United States, if you get your architecture degree, you are not considered a master builder. If I actually wanted to go and construct a building, I would have to go and get a contractor's license. It's a little insulting. Obviously, the word architect has also now kind of taken on this other meaning, right? We now have software architects. Architect is really the deviser, maker, creator of anything. I love that definition because it means we as architects, and I know there are architects in this room, this is what we do, right? We devise, we create, we make anything that we put our mind to. I'm a little passionate about this, can you tell? So I'm going to give you a little brief history on architecture. There really wasn't a sense of what an architect was or who architects were or what architects meant. There were architects, but it was a bit of the Wild West. And the reality is there wasn't any kind of defined group of that. So In 1857, a group of white men got together in New York City and said, you know what, we're kind of losing control over what's going on. We don't really, there's a lot of people who are saying they're architects, there's a lot of people who are saying they're builders, and it would be great if we could actually kind of market this a little differently. So we're going to create this group. It was, I think, the New York Society of Architects when it started, but it ultimately became the American Institute of Architects, AIA. The American Institute of Architects is here today, going strong. I think there's 90,000 architects today as part of the American Institute of Architects. It's a professional organization. It is not the organization that licenses architects. That is the National Council of Architectural Registration Board, NCARB, not nearly as sexy a name. So 1897, Illinois becomes the first state to actually license architects. So in 1857, we have a group of men who say, you know what, maybe we should have a thing that defines what architecture is or who architects are. 1897, again, Illinois first state, Great Fire of Chicago, 1891. There's probably a reason architects and licensing started in Illinois, right? Because a whole bunch of people came in, didn't maybe have the credentials, maybe there was some philandering, there was stuff going on with money, but there was a little loss of control. To be clear, up through 1919, actually let me rephrase that, in 1919, Illinois stated the requirement for becoming a licensed architect is you had to have 3 years of experience under a reputable architect. It's not necessarily a high bar. But it tells you what's going on right in the rest of the world, or at least in the country. So in 1901, California begins certifying architects, and I say this because if you wrote a letter to your client saying, I'm going to do your drawings, I'm going to do your specifications, I'm going to design your building, but I'm going to tell you I'm not an architect, you could still be hired as an architect. So it wasn't until 1963 that California actually said, you now must have a license to be an architect. Again, pre-1946, you had to have 10 years of experience. That could be 10 years of experience, it could be partial education, partial experience. And I'm picking these states because they're kind of up and down the rail line, right? 1921, Arizona begins licensing architects. Colter did her work well before 1921 in the Grand Canyon. 1921, Minnesota begins licensing architects. Again, 6 years experience, could be education, could be experience, could be some kind of mix of the two. 1932, New Mexico begins licensing architects. John Gaumeme, absolutely instrumental in this. In fact, he's the third licensed architect in New Mexico. Again, 4 years experience required or education equivalent. This is kind of like saying you really just need to be working under a reputable architect. 1941, Missouri begins licensing architects, first architecture license in 42, right? Most of this is happening well after or at the end of Colter's life. All right, I added something, I want to make sure I get it. Okay, so what's going on with women in architecture? Are there women in architecture? In 1870, right? One female out of 2,000 people in the census who have identified themselves as architects is a woman. In the 1890 census, they've actually lumped all of this together. Drafters, architects, designers, so less than 2% of that lump are women, so 22. 1900, as of 1900, 39 women had graduated from architecture programs. This is kind of a big deal because the reality is MIT was the first architecture program in the United States, and it started in 1868. Cornell started in 1871, University of Illinois 1873, Columbia 1881, and then the outlier Tuskegee 1881, right? There's not a lot of architecture programs, much less people graduating from them, much less does that make a difference to whether you can call yourself an architect or not. So in 1950, 1.2% of architects are women. 2014, 17%. So, and 2018. So as of last year, this is licensed architects. So 20% of architects who are licensed in the United States are female today. Yes, yes, go Melissa. Yes. This is a big deal, but it means that it's still a tough profession, right? There's still an awful lot of male domination in this, which is great because we love men. I love men. You know, the reality is construction's a tough job, right? It's a lot of slinging stuff. You need body weight. You actually need strength to move stuff around. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about a profession where it's still hard to, do I say, you know, the Rodney Dangerfield thing? Is there respect for women in architecture? It's coming. And it's because we're all pushing it, right? So, how does architecture work? If I, as an architect, go into another state to do a project, the reality is I'm going to go and hire a local architect because I'm not as familiar with the rules or the laws in Texas as I am in New Mexico. So the reality is I'm going to go in and I'm going to probably partner with another company, or I'm going to hire another company. I might be the design architect. They're probably the ones who are stamping the drawings, who actually are literally putting their stamp on the drawings, because, again, they're the ones who are licensed in that state. I'm not licensed in that state. This was not going on in Colter's era, but the reality is I, as a licensed architect in New Mexico, can call myself an architect. If I go to Texas where I am not licensed, I cannot call myself an architect. Ridiculous, but that's the way it works. So I want to ask a question before I kind of move on to this next slide. Stephen brought up the Howard Johnson company. Anyone here, can anyone name the Howard Johnson architect? Anyone? Do you think it's because it was a company man or woman? It's amazing that we're talking about Colter, because at the end of the day, she was a company architect. So, here's my test questions. Clearly, we all think of Louis Henry Sullivan as being an architect. Don't think anybody would question that, right? He only went to school for 1 year. It would have been when MIT was actually offering architecture courses. He apprenticed in an architecture firm, so we're assuming he worked for a reputable architect. He must have been brilliant because when he got hired by Dankmar Adler in 1879, in 1 year he was made a partner. The reality is, he is an architect. No question, not one person would question that, right? Frank Lloyd Wright never had any formal training, never went to architecture school. He actually only went to school for 2 years at UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he took some civil engineering courses. He didn't even study civil engineering. He just randomly took some classes. And then he left and he apprenticed at the previous Adler and Sullivan, so clearly, again, apprenticed at a reputable architect's firm. Then let's talk about Marion Mahoney Griffin. How many people in this room have heard of her? Okay, guess what? Company woman. She was the first employee Frank Lloyd Wright hired. She went to architecture school. She apprenticed under an architect. She was an architect. Clearly, we all think about Frank Lloyd Wright as being an architect. That beautiful watercolor down there, that's what she did for Frank Lloyd Wright, quite apart from most of his designs. The face of Frank Lloyd Wright came from the drawings that Marion Mahoney Griffin did. Again, company architect. Julia Morgan. I find it ironic that the women are the ones who went to school. Julia Morgan was actually the first woman to graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts. The first woman, again, with a degree in architecture. 1904, established her first office. So the reality is, right, California is licensing architects in 1901. No question this woman was an architect. Not a person in this room is going to disregard that. Guess what? Her name was on the door, over 700 buildings. Everybody in this room has heard of the Hearst Castle. Corbu. No formal education. He went, no formal education, right? Went to art school. Largely self-taught. At some point in 1908, he decided He had done a lot of research. He had traveled the French countryside, decided he wanted to actually go learn more about architecture, and so actually went and worked in the office of Auguste Perret, who actually is the father of concrete work, which makes a lot of sense when you then go and look at what Corbu did. The reality is he worked for 14 months under a reputable architect. No formal education. Not a question everybody in this office, in this room has heard of him. Every single person would say that Corbu is an architect. So you know where I'm going with this, right? So here's the beautiful image that Arnold was talking about. Mary Elizabeth Jane Colter, right? Miss E.J. Colter. Went to the School of Design, California, apprenticed under an architect. I think we've all read that. It's in multiple places. I don't think any of us know where or who that was. She went back and taught in high school mechanics art. She meets every single requirement of what every other male was doing to be considered an architect in this time period. And I'm going to let her close my talk.
I don't need mine yet. I'm just going to talk for a minute.
Which one is yours?
Saving Coulter's Legacy. So, actually, you can leave the first one up.
Okay.
Well, I do have a degree in architecture. And I actually got my license, although it took me a while, and I finally ended up being licensed in Georgia, even though I did my professional studies at Arizona State. When I joined the National Park Service, you didn't, because you're working as a Fed, you didn't really have to have a license because the licenses were at a state level. And so we're better than the states, right? But I thought, no, in terms of working with other peers, other professionals, I want to make sure it's clear that I have my credentials. So I went ahead and pursued the licensing. And so I got licensed in Georgia and then carried that license with me everywhere else I went in the course of my career. So I am now a retired architect. Not doing that anymore. I've been out of architecture school, I don't know, for about 15 years or so. The early 80s, things were not good in Arizona for architectural firms. I had a partner and we were doing small work, and people were trying to have us help them figure out how to raise money. So we would do design work and then they'd figure out whether they wanted to pay us. That wasn't working very well. So I got a call, would you like to go work at Grand Canyon as a historic architect? And most of the work I was doing had to do with historic architecture. And I said, sure. I mean, it was a short-term job, but I know the feds paid eventually. And so on July 10th, 1983, I got a call that said, you've got a job, come up to Grand Canyon. And it was, I think, 117 in Phoenix at the time. And I said, okay, that's a good thing. So I went up to the canyon, and that was the start of a 26-year career that took me all over the country, places I couldn't believe that I was actually being able to go and work on things I could never have remotely imagined. But I started at Grand Canyon, and there were a couple of things in terms of going into that job. First of all, the Park Service was responsible for overseeing the work that the concessioner did on the buildings that the concessioner had possessory interest in, which really meant that the concessioner still had a vested financial interest in the properties, like El Tovar Hotel, And the Park Service had title, but we didn't really have any leverage, except for the fact that all the work done on historic buildings had to be cleared through the park staff. And so when I went to Grand Canyon, I was the person that they had to work with. And as it turned out, I was not only doing review work, but I also was sort of like the local historic architect resource for the concessioner in terms of work on historic buildings. Now we're talking about historic buildings at Grand Canyon. I was the first historic architect that actually worked at the canyon on a permanent basis. And when I got there, there was not much of a sense that historic buildings were important in Grand Canyon because this is a national natural park. It took a while, but by 1987, there had actually been a study done of National Historic Landmark buildings in the National Park system, and Grand Canyon had more individual buildings listed as part of the landmarks program than any other park in the country. And a good portion of those on the South Rim were Colter buildings. So I get there, I've been doing some work, but I'd never heard of Mary Jane Colter when I got there. But pretty quickly, I was working on projects that involved the buildings that she designed. And one of the first that I can remember, now let me just say, when I was asked to be on this panel, I'm going back almost 40 years I don't have any notes, I don't have any photographs, so some of this is what I'm pretty sure I remember accurately. But one of the first projects that I was asked to go take a look at had to do with Hopi House. And in the entry sort of area to Hopi House, as you're going toward the main door on the left-hand side, there's a wing that comes down, and there's a set of sort of steps that come down to the ground and then go up the wall to the second story. Well, concessioners and the government tend to be concerned about liability. And there were kids who sort of said, oh, I can climb up that. And they were just, my bosses were just worried that somebody's going to get up there, fall down, break a leg or whatever. And they said, we want you to figure out how to stop that. And we're thinking of putting up some railings or tearing off part of that wall so they can't get up there. So I went out and took a look at it and said, you know what, let's plant yucca right in front of the steps. So that was already part of the landscape. We just took some plants and put them right where they would interfere with anybody doing what they shouldn't do. And that was a very simple technique of preserving the work that Colter had done. I was approaching this using the Secretary Standards for Treatment of Historic Properties, which is basically you just don't tear off original material, you respect the historic character of the building, and so I was looking for a non-intrusive way of solving this problem. Obviously putting up signs wasn't going to do the job, but I was pretty sure that things like railings, steel pipe, and tearing off the part of the building wasn't the right way to go either. So that was an example of a very simple thing that I got involved with. And I think that was important because it started sending a message both to concessioners and to park management that there are principles that we use in taking care of historic buildings. And the solution can be very simple. Just take your time, look at the situation, and figure out how to work through that while being mindful of the building itself. I know that I went out to Watchtower. I can't remember exactly what I was looking at. I think I was there actually just to make a short report about the paintings. So I'm delighted to know that after all these years that actually some work has been done to save those. I know I went down to Phantom Ranch, Lookout Studio, and sometimes it was just checking to see what the maintenance program was, making sure that things were being done that would minimize adverse effects on the buildings. I can remember going out to Hermit's Rest, and I went out early in the day, and so there weren't too many tourists, and actually, it was early enough, and it was probably on an off part of the season, because I could actually experience the space. And I'm so happy to hear that they've been moving merchandising out of some of the spaces, because one of the things that had happened over time was that the company and the people who knew about these buildings and had a feeling for them as experiences for visitors were gone. And you just had people who were there who only cared about selling as many Chinese rubber tomahawks as possible. And it was hard. I mean, basically the merchandising was getting in the way of any experience. But I can remember standing in Hermit's Rest in front of that big fireplace and looking at it, and then I left there and I was looking at there wasn't much research that was available to me, but I suddenly realized that Colter had antiqued that interior before it opened with smoky torches. And that left me with an idea that has helped me as an architect my entire career, and that is that as architects, one of the things we do is we create stage sets. We create environments where people are able to live out their lives, play out their roles. And I think I've been sort of fundamental, looking at functional requirements and all that. I didn't quite get the emotional stuff. And that space and the idea of her creating this feeling that this had been occupied for decades before it actually was opened really helped me appreciate the emotional quality of architecture. And then there was a project that I got involved with at Bright Angel Lodge. Bright Angel, as you know, has the main lodge and then a bunch of cabins, and the main company, the concessionaires, came forward with a proposal to put in blown-in insulation in the walls of the cabins in order for the cabins to be used all year long. They were not designed to be used in the wintertime. And so that proposal went forward to Washington, and Washington said, no, you can't do that. The reason being that at the time, the kind of insulation that they were looking at was treated with a boric compound, and when you got condensation inside the wall, it would leach out the boric compound, which would become boric acid, which would then destroy the walls. It was intended to kill insects, but it had this other unintended, very bad consequence. So the company said, well, if we don't get to do that, we're tearing the cabins down. And so I sat down, I thought, I had a class in mech and elec, and I had to calculate things like dew point and so on and so forth. So I basically took the climatic data for Grand Canyon, wrote a short paper, sent it to Washington explaining that because of the conditions at Grand Canyon, that we would not get condensation inside the walls that they were worried about. And they okayed it, and it was the first time that they'd okayed it, and that saved the cabins. Now, the reality is that I was doing this all without very much information about Colter or the buildings. And so later in my career, I had the opportunity to work on proposals for use of historic structure reports. And let me just, I'm going to go through a couple slides. What I'm going to say is that every Colter building should have a historic structure report. That this is essential to the protection of these buildings, not just for the next couple of years, but for the next 100 or 200 years. And what you can't depend on is informed, enlightened, and caring owners. You're going to get people along the way who don't get it, and stuff is going to go missing in terms of why Mary Jane Colter did certain things. And so the value of a historic structure report is it's focused on the information about that building. And it's a guide for taking care of that building for as long as that building stands. And so whether it's in private hands or whether it's in public hands, every Mary Jane Colter building should have a historic structure report. That's really what I'm asking you to do, is You know, at this point, I haven't had time to check and see how many buildings have historic structure reports, but my guess is that some do and probably the majority don't. So what is a historic structure report? I actually wrote the article, and there's an ASTM standard that has to do with historic structure reports. And just very quickly in the forward, the purpose of the report is to serve as a reference so we can minimize the loss of significant material or character when making decisions that will affect a historic structure. It should reflect the size of the report, how active we get in terms of putting money and time into it should depend on the significance of the structure, the potential impact of a pending decision, and available information. And then last is that there should be flexibility in terms of format. And I'm saying this because at one point in my career, I worked with a group that prepared a 1,000-page historic structure report for San Cristobal in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and it was almost entirely a history of the Spanish Empire, not information about the building I was trying to save. And so this was a common problem we had in the National Park Service, and that's why we did this particular piece. So there basically are four parts: historical context, physical description, proposed actions, and documentation of actions. So when we talk about historic context, there's supposed to be a photograph there of Lookout Studio, so just visualize that, okay? So when we talk about historic context, there's a huge amount of information that's being accumulated about Mary Jane Colter, about her work, about her life. And you don't need to put all that into the historic structure report for a specific building. You can just do a quick summary, and then what you want to do is to focus on this particular building, how it fits into her career, the critical dates of the project, and any information that explains her intentions, decisions, and specific areas of concern. And I'll give you an example that I know is in the book, and there's talk about colors and how concerned she was about colors. Well, blue doesn't quite make it as a reference when you're actually trying to match a color that she picked. And so you want to get as much information as you can to put context around those decisions. And then we get to physical description, and there are two big categories here. When we talk about integrity, for a historic building designed by Colter, the materiality of that building the day it opened is what you're trying to protect. Unless she made additions and modifications to it afterwards, it's the way that looked, the materials, the details, all the craftsmanship, and that you want to contrast with condition. You might have something that was original to the building, but it's ready to fall down. You just need to make a note in terms of, is this good condition, is this bad condition? That has to do with both structural integrity and functionality and how something has weathered, as well as then this other part that has to do with how much of this building actually dates back to the day the building was opened. And then we have the section on proposed actions. If it's a little thing, you don't have to do a whole lot of work, but what you want to do is to have an accumulation of records about decisions that were made, large or small. Putting in a new heating system, expanding a kitchen, changing a particular function. Those kinds of things are important to document. And so what you want to do is to consider alternatives, just like I said about the issue with Hopi House. You'd want to say, well, we looked at 3 options. We could have taken down the wall, we could have put up a steel frame to keep people out, or we could have planted yucca, and we decided to plant yucca because it had the least impact on the building. And that is a kind of information we need to preserve and pass on to future owners and managers of our properties. And then documentation of actions, and this is, you've made a decision, so you take a picture of where you put the yucca. Or you take a picture of the new structural system that you put in place. And then Last, I just want to say that the form of this can be files, just keep them organized. That's usually where we start. And then at a certain point, you start working toward 3-ring binders and making divisions and putting draft reports together. You can go up to the point of a report, and that's usually done when you're at a point of really summarizing a lot of work that's been done and a lot of research that's been done. And then last is actually doing a formal publication, and that is going to cover historic context and the integrity and condition of the building at the time and what work that you did. And that will then provide continued information for future owners and managers in terms of preserving Colter's legacy. Thank you.
You guys bring your chairs together. So we're going to take some questions from the panel. I have a couple questions for you as well. I'm curious, since we raised this issue, Alan and Tina, do you know how many of the buildings that you've worked with have this level of historical? And is the state required to do that? I mean, who does that? Does the people who own it? Does
Yes. The people who own it, I'm supposed to be mic'd.
Oh, in that case.
I'm like, am I mic? Oh, there you go. The people who own the buildings are the ones who are paying for the historic structures report. This is a federal requirement. It actually has to be or a state, it has to be a historic architect who's actually licensed or certified to do historic structures reports. And I say this because the irony is, clearly I've done a ton of research on La Fonda. I could not do a historic structures report on La Fonda because I am not a historic architect.
If I could just add to that, though,
I hear
if you're not, if you're doing it because you're an owner and you're enlightened and you simply want to pull stuff together, my point is that there's a structure that
Right.
recommends how to do that. So it might not be an officially sanctioned report.
Correct.
But I think, and that's really when you're getting into analysis of part 2, which has to do with the integrity and conditions part. But my guess is that most Colter buildings actually have files backing up some of what they've done. And it's more about making sure that that stuff doesn't get lost as a first level of concern.
I'd be curious to ask the whole panel, what Colter work do you think needs to be done, and who should be doing it? I mean, who should be broadening the study of Colter? Who should be broadening our whatever biography we can do of her? I mean, I feel like to some degree, I know the materials I worked with in my book. I know what Arnold worked with. I feel like sometimes we are grasping at the same straws over and over. And I do wonder if we have tried hard enough, or if we have encouraged the next generation of academics or the next generation of architects, whoever it's going to be, to ask better questions, to look at better places. I don't know. Are we trying hard enough? And what can we do to improve our understanding of her personally, of the work better, and also to put it in a better context than I think we've been able to do? Arnold, you want to start?
Do I need to use the?
No, you have your mic.
Your mic
Oh,
too.
hello. I mean, no, we haven't done enough. You do the book and it ends there, but biographies are followed by biographies and more research. And as I indicated in talking about research I would like to do, I think most of, if not all of those avenues are definitely worth pursuing, and often through other people who knew Colter, to go, you're doing this tree trunk and you're going off to the side. We need to go off more to the side to get interactions between Colter and all these other people. And I don't think there's much more to be done in that area.
I would agree with that, and I say that because there's, since Colter spent her last 10 years here and died here, right, there's people that I run into, older people who knew Miss Colter, and they're very clear, you were never allowed to call her anything except Miss Colter, and she chain smoked, and she was not always polite, and her definitely teeth clacked. But that generation is dying.
Yes.
And so it's great that we have the Harveys, and it's great that we have the books, and the reality is, I agree with Arnold that those next branches that are going off of people who actually knew her, even tangentially, that piece, it would be nice to get information. And that's really just a call to arms of who wants to be interviewed.
And with regard to historic structure reports, I think the place to start is probably by getting information about what the status of documentation is for every building, whether there is in fact a historic structure report or part of a historic structure report, or where the files are. And then it's simply a matter of putting together proposals, getting grants, getting support from whoever's owning or managing the property, and then doing contracts to get that done. But the other point that I want to make is that a historic structure report is never done as long as the building is still standing. And so this is really about the bulk of a historic structure report, in some sense, is getting it up to a point where it's in a position where it can simply be maintained. But even when you do that, you're going to want to have all that other information about regular maintenance, or there was a bad snowstorm and something happened and a part of a roof collapsed and all that sort of stuff. You need to have all that information documented, and you keep putting it together, keeping it organized, so that when the next owner and the next architect get involved, they have a basis for making good decisions.
You know, I think it's really interesting. There has not been as much oral history work done. I mean, you know, a lot of what we have in Fred Harvey started with Leslie Poling Kemp's doing an oral history of Harvey girls in the 80s. And I mean, her book originally was a big oral history project on whoever was alive. And so I will say, as somebody who's used all these different projects, I'm surprised how few of them there are.
Right.
Considering how many people are interested in this, that it's taught, I mean, Harvey girls are taught in the schools. People in the Southwest, I think, know these stories. I come across relatively few theses that are about, there's hardly any people who've been talking to these people. Are we going to talk to them before they die? I'm surprised, and you know, I'm not daring you guys to do it, but you feel free to do it. But I do think that it is as important as a lot of the things that we do oral history projects on, and we really haven't. So I would push that. Do we have questions from the audience? Are we using this microphone, or do you have another microphone for them?
That's the other one.
Go ahead. Him and then him.
Yeah, I don't need a microphone, but do Ms. Colter's buildings fall under the category of National Historic Registry? Can they be, are they registered?
Yes. Oops.
Yes.
Yes, they're either individually been listed or as part of a group in a district like the Grand Canyon National Park Historic District. And some of them are on the, I guess, the lowest level, which is the National Register. But if you get to a higher level of whatever praise, you can become a National Historic Landmark. So you're talking about both the individual building designations as well as districts. So I think it'd be yes, 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 those have been. I mean, I was going to say before that that's part of the record that perhaps we need to go back and look at, all the voluminous, you know, verbiage or whatever that went into creating the application to put them on the National Register and to do the district and to make some of them National Historic Landmarks. And those were done some time ago, but I don't think they've been read lately.
Well, and to clarify, if a building is in a National Historic District, La Fonda is a building in a National Historic District, so it is already protected. La Fonda doesn't have its own historic building designation because it doesn't need to have that. With that said, there's a ton of research that's been done, and you know, Jenny's got copious records of what has happened in the past. So to Arnold's point, there are levels, and the majority of Santa Fe is historic districts, and this is partly why people hate historic districts, because you end up included in that even if you never said you wanted your building specifically on that.
We need to make a clarification in that national recognition will not prevent a building from being torn down. It'll prevent it from being modified, usually if there's some federal money involved, et cetera. The true protection, and this is like one of the bases of the preservation movement, is that the local people have historic districts, have landmark ordinances, and that is what I know you have in Santa Fe.
Right.
And that, I imagine, if it's strong enough, is what protects La Fonda, as opposed to it being on the National Register.
It's all three.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can say it's on the register and scare people.
Right.
This question is for anyone on the stage that can answer it, but I know from reading Stephen's book that Mary Jane Colter, the La Posada never made money the whole time that it was opened because it was opened mainly during the Depression. But I know she felt badly about that from reading Stephen's book, but I'm hoping someone can tell me that she was tough enough to respond and bounce back from that and not become another Vincent van Gogh.
think that's yours.
You know, could feel good about the beautiful place that she created, because it was such a beautiful place.
That's right.
That's yours. You're the expert.
You know, it's interesting you say that, and I think actually Arnold wrote about that a little more than I did. But one of the things that I think is unusual with the Fred Harvey Company, we always have to remind ourselves, Mary Colter, I don't think, thought of herself as being like Vincent van Gogh. I mean, Mary Colter was a hard-working designer and architect who churned out a ton of work. And the Harveys and the people who worked for them were not the kind of egotists that we now expect of people who create this kind of cool stuff. And I think sometimes we impose our idea of what those people are like today, these larger-than-life characters. I don't think any of them really wanted to be larger-than-life characters. I think they wanted to create larger-than-life buildings. I think they wanted to create a larger-than-life service economy. They wanted to create places where you could shine. But I think we have to be careful, because my guess is that Mary Colter spent a lot of her days in Kansas City in an office, you know, with piles of stuff on her desk that had to be done. One of the things that I found that I thought was most interesting was just a list of her going through like all the paint colors in a Harvey House in Texas. Just like so many potchky little things. It was so unglamorous. It was also in a pile of stuff in a Trainiac guy's house, just like this high. And it was just, you know, you think the number of just pieces of paper that had to be filed to make sure that something cool or something that was really no big deal in a building was done. So I think that part of what is great about the Harvey legacy is how strongly it continues. But I think you have to remember that these people were not, they didn't see it the same way we do. You know, they romanticized the Southwest. They created their company so that people could, in America and from all over the world, could come to the Southwest especially and feel the romance of it and learn about it. But they didn't, I don't think they saw themselves as stars the way we see them today. And I think that's part of the reason why there's so little Colter stuff.
Well, one part, and this is true of architects in general, I hear this complaint, is that even today, when you read a piece about a new building, especially in the general press, they don't mention who the architect is.
Right.
And going back to the Colter era, it's hard to find even that her name is in there as a designer, as a hod carrier. I mean, you know, she's not in there because, and it wasn't because of her, it's
There's
because
some
going,
talk about
the farther back you go, and I think you agree with me, the architect, whoever they are, simply is never mentioned.
Right.
It's this new building, and that's it. That's all the press wants, or wanted.
Certainly all that Trump wants. I mean, and I don't mean that facetiously.
Yeah.
He's the developer, he's the producer of his buildings, his name is on the buildings.
And who are his architects?
Who, they're not paid.
To do the research that you're talking about on the buildings, does that have to go through the National Park Service?
No.
Anyone can do it then?
Well, I think it depends on whether you're dealing with a specific program that requires a historic structure report. But what I want to say is that regardless of what the other programs are, Tax Act or any other special programs, that the actual pulling together of existing data and of doing research, I think that's stuff, if you're interested in it, you can do it. And so rather than waiting for just the right person to do it, I'm much more interested in making sure that we save the stuff, that it's you know, at least in the same box or in the same filing cabinet. My own experience, I mean, there's a part of this where I just go to sort of what's the simplest kind of thing to do. And I think well-informed, motivated volunteers can do a huge amount of this work. And just getting it organized. And then, yeah, you want to have people who have a little more experience in terms of understanding what they're looking at in terms of colors or materials in particular, and trying to figure out, well, what parts of the building really do date back to the beginning. Sometimes that's tough, and that's really tricky, and you do need a professional with good eyes, and you might need to have laboratory analysis of materials. But much of the rest of it, particularly records of work that's already been done, that's about collecting it and organizing it so then it can be synthesized into some kind of reasonable pattern so you can use it in the future.
How can we ensure that nothing like the destruction of the Alvarado ever happens again?
I would, having spent most of my career in preservation, when I wrote the book on Mary Colter, I compared the loss of the Alvarado, the wrenching loss that the entire city felt, and that's absolutely true, to the loss in New York City of Penn Station. They're the same, they're twins, it's like Gemini. And part of the way to prevent this from continuing is simply the preservation folks have been hitting on this, let's appreciate, let's inventory, let's save more and more buildings. And they're, having done that over decade after decade after decade, has made a dent of a major point. And today, I could say confidently, you would not have lost the Alvarado. It would still be there. If the proposed destruction came, 2 years ago, it would still be standing there. And for that matter, so the same thing for Penn Station.
My theory actually is that the reason there's hardly any Fred Harvey activity in Albuquerque is the collective sense of just grief and loss that they let that building go. Because it's very odd. I mean, almost every other Fred Harvey city has some sense of itself as a Fred Harvey city, and Albuquerque almost none at all, when in fact it was the center of Fred Harvey life for many decades. And it's still inexplicable. I mean, I still hope it happens, but it really is very odd.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because going to the hotel and coming into Albuquerque and asking people, well, they say, where are you going? To the Fred Harvey weekend. What's Fred Harvey? And I start at the top, I go, they did this, they're glazed. And I say, the bottom thing I tried to relate to them, I say, the movie The Harvey Girls? No. Then I go, Judy Garland? They don't know Judy Garland. So it's exactly, people in Albuquerque that I talk to.
How many here have heard of Judy Garland? Just as a little reality check. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing relative to saving historic buildings. I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to say, if you can't preserve it exactly, then it just goes. And I think that the reality is that along the way, there often are compromises that need to be made. The Bright Angel cabins, where the blow-in insulation went in, have two little holes at the top and the bottom of the planks where they blew in the insulation. That was a change in the character, but that saved the buildings. And I think sometimes we get so hung up in trying to maintain the purity of the original design that we sometimes lose a sense of what the possibilities are if it really comes to it. What if we put a different function in the building? What if we do accommodate new uses? How does this relate to changes that are happening in the neighborhood or the particular district? And so I think the last thing I would suggest is that we need to stay flexible. We need to stay nimble. We need to know what we're trying to protect. But ultimately, it's as much as you can save when you're confronted with a devastating choice. You just try to save as much as you can.
This isn't a question. I can answer that question that was just asked about how to save these Fred Harvey buildings, because that's what my husband and I have been doing for decades. You all can help save them. Come visit us. Come stay at the hotels. We just opened the Castaneda. Eat at the restaurants. Go to Langley Station. Every single person that visits us, they say thank you for helping save these. And I say thank you for helping save them, because You're coming to them, you're staying at them. If everybody stayed at the Alvarado, if the rooms were full every night, that building would still be staying. It's when people stop coming. People don't go to the restaurant, they don't visit them. That's when they die.
And I'm just going to add on to what Tina said. And Tina and Alan are clearly doing amazing work at the
Lord's work.
Castaneda and Posada. But I think Tina nailed it. And, Billy said this earlier. If we're emotionally attached to these buildings because they're culturally important to us, we're going to save them. The flip side of that is if at some point we make these buildings so precious, and I'm using that word very specifically, that they actually don't have room to grow and move with us and accommodate new uses, then we're also killing the buildings in a different way. And so it's really important that we're emotionally attached, but we really do have that ability to let the buildings and those that have come before breathe with us as we move them forward.
We're going through a lot of this problem in El Paso of trying to save our old buildings. And I need to say that one gentleman did save one in a unique way. It was the St. Regis Hotel that Tom Gable came. He's the one that got the Harvey Girl name. And he came there and bought the St. Regis Hotel, worked on it and stayed with it for 9 years. And so we were so proud of that, but of course it burned down. So when the people that redid the two buildings later and redid and rebuilt that one, they put the facade of the St. Regis Hotel on the front of that building. So if you're ever near the plaza, you can look and see that building is still there. We still have a part of it.
Well, I want to thank this panel, and I want to apologize for our technical difficulties. And for this reason, I'm going to take a break now. So we're going to take a 15-minute break now. So, as those of you who've been to this weekend know, one of the highlights of it for us has been the Harvey family members who actually had a hand in the business, who have great memories of the business, and we've had wonderful interviews here and speeches about just the broadest possible subject matter, everything from Daggett Harvey talking about the years of the book that I didn't pay enough attention to and excoriating me for that, which is all fair. And I do think that the time period that he worked in the company deserves better than he got. To people talking about their personal memories. Last year we had an amazing talk by Katie Miller about mental illness and addiction, not only in the Harvey family, but I think in the hospitality business as well. If you weren't here for that, I have to say there was not a dry eye in the house. So every one of these family talks has been different. And this talk this year is going to be completely different because it's going to be about music. So Julian Harvey is the third of the three children of Byron Harvey Jr., who was the son of Byron Harvey Sr. And what he and I have been talking about for a long time, actually, is the role of music in the Harvey Company. And what is amazing is that after all these conversations, and every year I say to Julian, like, should we talk to you this year? And he's like, what would I talk about? And blah, blah, blah. And then lo and behold, I guess in August, or maybe July, a bunch of us who were on the Harvey family email listserv got this email from Julian in Paris, and he said, I wrote something, and I'd like you all to listen to it. And so I am thrilled to be able to have you listen to it. So this is a new composition by Julian Harvey, inspired by his life as a Harvey. This is a picture of him as a kid looking at his train. This piece is called The Magic Train. I think you will recognize some of its influences. And given how this day has gone technologically, I will just take a chance here.
I have to say that it helps to steal good material.
So when I got this in email, Julie and I started we had a Skype conversation, Paris to Philly, and we talked about music, and we talked about, he always says, like, I don't remember that much about the business, I wasn't in the business that much, but the music part of it is really interesting. I'm first curious, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what inspired this besides the Harvey girls? I mean, where does some of the imagery come from?
I was in France, in Antibes, and it seems to me I was hearing an awful lot of celesta music, if you can believe it, in the restaurants and the bars, and even in the pop music. So I think that sound got into my head. And so
Remind me never to drink there.
Right, or maybe I should drink there. And so I had this idea of this kind of flowing thing, and I thought, oh my goodness, what do I do now? You know, I always joke in starting a piece, the first note's easy, the second note is a little bit tricky. So, all right, let's move on to the fact that I've always wanted to contribute something to this event. And I never quite knew what. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe I could do something with on the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. So I threw that in, and it all seemed to work out very well. And I thought, well, maybe I can play it, you know, when the family gets together, and, you know, it's fun. I never expected it to end up here, I assure you. But here it is.
I think it worked very well. So, in talking about this after you composed it and after you sent it to me, I actually did not realize, I mean, obviously people know that Johnny Mercer wrote the music for the songs in the Harvey Girls movie. I really did not understand until you explained to me that Johnny Mercer actually had sort of a pre-existing relationship with your family before this, and that you had remained friends with him as a young composer trying to have him help you.
Right.
So why don't you talk a little bit about what Johnny Mercer was like and what his relationship was like with the family?
First of all, my parents were very good friends with the Mercers, but I don't think that had anything to do at all with the fact that Mercer and Harry Warren were hired to do the songs for the movie. I think the two things were totally separate, interestingly enough. It's interesting how this whole thing came about. There was a show in 1925 called the Garrett Gaieties in New York. You know, one of these chorus girl shows. There were a lot of those shows at that time. And Rogers and Hart were writing for that, and this is of interest to me, if not to anybody else. The song Manhattan came out of that show. Then the next year, 26, they did it again, and the song Mountain Greenery, also a great song, not as well known, I don't think, came out. So there was a little gap in years. In 1930, there was another Garrett Gaieties. There was well, let me say, Johnny Mercer came to New York from Savannah, Georgia, and he basically was going to be an actor, but he got into the songwriting game, and he wrote a song called Out of Breath and Scared to Death of You. And this song actually was used in the 1930 Garrett Gaieties and made a big hit. In that show, there was a woman whose name was Elizabeth Meltzer. She, because of somebody else that was in another show, changed her name to the stage name of Ginger Meehan. She eventually married Johnny Mercer quite soon, so it became, you know, Ginger Mercer and Johnny Mercer. There was another woman in that show, 1930, who was my mother. So they became very good friends. That's how this whole thing started.
Well, that's right. Your father was an actor.
Well, he was, but he wasn't in the Garrett Gaieties.
But he wanted to be an actor.
He definitely did, and there are people who think that's what he really wanted to do his whole life. Well, he ended up in the Harvey Girls. He had a
bit part.
Small part.
So in preparing for this, Julian sent me a couple of pictures. So these are, imagine having Christmas at the Grand Canyon. I mean, I must say it must have been pretty cool for the Harveys. To have Christmas at the Grand Canyon. What room is this? Where is this?
You know, I haven't the slightest idea. If you look at me, I'm quite young, and I don't remember, and I don't know how it got so beautifully decorated, but it was fun. I want to mention, well, I guess it's a little hard for me to see from here, but that's Helen, that's my brother Ronnie, and Theo, who took care of us, me. I guess that's Helen there. That picture fascinates me. That's my brother, and then I'm on the left there, and I'm 99% positive that's Porter Tamici, who I was just in awe of. I thought he was fabulous.
Who was Porter Tamici?
He worked for the Fred Harvey Company for nearly 50 years. He did the dances. He had dealt with the dances at Grand Canyon. He worked in the Hopi House. He traveled for the company. He was really something. And I assume that's one of his sons, who I believe he had two, I believe, and they became muralists, I believe, or painters. I'd like to know. But there they are.
So you sent me this very exotic picture
Yes.
of you and your mom and your brother.
Right.
It is heartbreaking that your brother Ronnie never got to come to this weekend, because he would have had the best time. I got to interview him not long before he passed away, and he was, I think for many years, the most enthusiastic person and the one who was most incredulous that people didn't know about all this. So he's missing out, but he's getting it somewhere. One of the things that we talked about that I learned a little bit about, and I would love to see people do more research on, you knew only a little bit about, the Fred Harvey Company had a history of orchestras. There were a number of orchestras. Obviously, La Fonda had an orchestra. There was a Grand Canyon orchestra. And there were orchestras that played at Fred Harvey, like Friday night dances. We have documentation of that all the way back to the earliest Harvey houses, the Harvey House in Laken, in 1879. I could actually tell you the band that played there at the dance where Fred Harvey's sister-in-law met Hardesty, the cattle rancher, because it was the music was just very much part of their lives. Yet we have very little, people haven't collected the records so much. I don't know how many of them are good, but especially up through the 1940s, there was so much music associated with the company. Maybe the Harvey girls just made it all seem so much smaller. But I always thought, like, the exotic idea of the orchestra of La Fonda during the Second World War, as I think I've said here before, I do think someone should remake Casablanca at La Fonda. And so let's look at some of the Johnny Mercer pictures. This is not a great reproduction, but there's an Al Hirschfeld drawing that was done for the Harvey girls, which actually I've never actually seen the actual version of it, but it's actually quite amazing. There was all kinds of art associated with it. But you sent me this. So tell me what this is.
In fact, it was my sister Helen who sent some of these pictures. This is a watercolor that Johnny Mercer did. I'm not sure I've ever seen it. It seems to me I've seen another one where there are sheep on a hill or something like that. Like so many
And it's signed
people, he had several skills. Oh, I guess so.
It's Santa Monica Pier?
Okay.
I love the fact-checking in the audience here. Could you guys all come when we're fact-checking my next book and just answer questions? That would be so great.
Well, I've never seen this before, so I'm
So
forgiven.
it's to Byron. This is actually could be part of, there actually are, I bet there are probably 20 paintings by famous artists that are signed to the Harvey family. It would be a fascinating show sometime. So, and these are just pictures of the Mercers and the Harveys hanging out, right? These are from your,
that's
either yours or for Helen's photo albums?
I think that must be 860 Lakeshore Drive where we lived. They would come and visit us all the time on the train from Los Angeles to New York or back, and that was fun. And I met their two children, and as I've mentioned to you, I've corresponded with one of them quite a bit for some number of years.
So did you see him as mentoring you in some way? Was that what you were hoping for?
When he first appeared on the scene, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know anything, and then slowly but surely, I started, asking him too many questions and bugging him, and so there was a feeling of that. He helped a lot of people and a lot of songwriters. He really wanted to, and he was great in that respect. I don't know where that one on the left is, but. And I can't really read what it says. That's my mother's writing. Ginger and Johnny Mercer.
Ginger and Johnny Mercer.
New Year's, maybe?
New Year's.
I guess so.
Well, it was pretty warm on New Year's that year.
I want to mention that. Go on to the next one. That picture, I'm not sure I've ever seen before. I was very touched to see that because in attempting to get ready for this, I bought a DVD of the movie The Harvey Girls. And on that DVD, you can listen to the plain movie, or you can listen to a voiceover by the director of that movie, George Sidney.
Right.
And he goes all the way through the whole movie and talks about everything you can imagine. Here's a picture of George Sidney with my father
Right.
dressed up as a conductor in the movie. I was really moved.
How
to
old were you when your
see
dad
that.
was in that movie?
Well, the movie came out in
46.
January '46. I was 2 at that time.
Okay. So you don't have a lot of personal memories of when it came out.
No.
Okay,
No,
but
I-
you do, and so does anybody recognize this? This little painting here? It's right out, right. So it's right, if you go out that door, that painting is there. Julian has loaned it to the exhibit here. I will say this is my all-time favorite Harvey-related painting, and it's part of a series. There are a couple more that the family owns that were done for Life magazine in celebration of the Harvey Girl movie, and the family kind of split them up after. And this is, tell us about this.
Well, it's a telegram. Actually, he seems to have sent it to my mother, but I asked him, I sent him, I guess, a tune, and he said he liked it, and he tried to get a lyric for it. He was not successful. I think he mentioned Tony Hatch, who did some songwriting back then, and Tony Hatch apparently showed no interest at all. But he sent this telegram. I'm not sure what the ecclesiastical music reference is. I may have written some choral stuff or something. So that's what that is.
And then this letter seems very encouraging to you. Julian, without remembering the others too well, except one I told you is rather Kernish, I think this is by far your most stylish tune.
Yeah.
So imagine being a songwriter and getting that note from Johnny Mercer.
Yeah.
That must have been kind of amazing.
It was fun, yes.
So can you tell us anything else about your relationship with him, or just about the role of music? I mean, the songs from the Harvey Girls movie, did you love them? Did they drive you crazy at a certain point? Did you want them out of your life? Are you re-embracing them now?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I, to be honest with you, kind of avoided the movie. It just felt so close, and it just kind of embarrassed me. I've certainly had heard the songs and seen the movie, but not carefully. I have, as I mentioned, seen it more recently, and I think it's a better movie than I was aware of. And I think that George Sidney was very proud of it and should have been. So that's about all I can say. I love the On the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. I don't know if anybody caught the reference in the middle that I stuck in, but there's a song in there which is, you can call it, well, one title is The Training Montage, and the other title is A Train Must Be Fed. And I stuck a little stuff from that in there, something about those are the requirements of a Harvey girl. I stuck that in. I don't know if anybody caught it. So, no, historically, no, I didn't have that much interest in the movie, but I do now, clearly.
What other memories do you have just of the company, of growing up in the company?
That's interesting. As far as being a customer, I used to go to, with my father often, the Grill in Chicago, which was in the Palmolive building. My wife, Catherine, used to go to, what was that? Right. So there was that. I worked for the company for one summer. I believe it was 1961. And I worked at the Fred Harvey Oasis. And I worked...
Wait, do you guys know what the Fred Harvey Oasis was? Raise your hand if you don't. Okay, a lot don't. So explain what the Fred Harvey Oasis was.
Well, it's basically a steel and glass building which stretched across the Illinois Turnpike. There were about...
The Illinois Tollway, yeah.
Tollway.
There were how many of them?
There were 5, I believe. But I was only in one of them, the Lake Forest. And I worked first in the snack bar and then in the retail where you basically clip newspapers, the wire around newspapers, and stick them up on the rack. And you learn how to make change. In the snack bar, it was something. It was much nicer inside where you could sit down. But the snack bar, there was a gigantic machine that made milkshakes. And you take this big bottle of stuff and pour it in and then press a button and the milkshake would come out and you'd give it to the customers. I was always very amused by that.
Did anybody want you to be in the business? I mean, what were the
Oh, I'm
kids
sure.
encouraged to be in the business?
Of course, of course.
And so when you
But
became a composer, what was that? How'd that conversation go?
Well, you know, I went to law school and then I went in the Army, and by the way, that was when all the earthquakes were happening about the Fred Harvey collection and the merger and the going public and all that. So I just couldn't take much part in it. I know for a fact that my father would have liked perhaps my brother or me to follow up in the business. My brother says that in one of his writings, that they were on the beach one day and my father said, you know, I wish somebody would come after. We didn't.
So what happened, and for those of you who haven't seen earlier talks of the family members have talked about, you know, basically at a certain point in the 60s, the next generation of the family who thought they were going to be inheriting and taking over the business were informed that their fathers had just made them quite wealthy, but that they weren't going to own the company anymore.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, I feel like the reunions that have come over the last 10 years around these things in Santa Fe, a lot of it has been healing from that. Because every person I interviewed when I was working on the book talked about the pain of that. Even though I don't think that running the company would have been that fun, because I think by that time it was less of a fun company, and it would have been hard, and I'm not sure that it would have been any different for you guys and the people who bought it. But I understand the pain of people thinking that that's their family legacy. I don't know, does it help a little bit that people are paying attention to Fred Harvey again?
Sure, it helps me. I'm thrilled by it.
We can take one or two questions, then we have to move on. Who has questions? Does anybody in the Kathy, let somebody from the family ask a question.
Where can we download that song that you did?
Do you want to share the song?
You know something, I may be overreacting. I'm a little concerned about copyright issues, but you know...
if Johnny Mercer comes after you...
he's going to, I'm telling you. He really is. You know, I have a website...
Say you're like a rapper. You're sampling.
I do have a website called julianharveymusic.com, and I could just stick it on there.
We should do that, and if it is, we'll send you a link. Of course, until the Santa Fe Philharmonic performs it, maybe we'll have a little string quartet here do that next year.
Yeah.
Let's get somebody who hasn't asked a question. You far back.
Can you tell us more about your music career? I think it's fascinating.
Well, I don't know what to say. You know, I'm reminded of my Aunt Laura. She had an exhibition somewhere, and she wrote a description of her art. And she starts out with a lot of words and a lot of stuff. And then at the end, she says, in other words, I paint what I feel like painting. That about describes my approach to music. I haven't had a huge amount of professional exposure. I've had some music published and a number of performances in Chicago, but it hasn't been an extensive career by any means. It's been a lot of, I would call it neoclassical, somewhat contemporary. I've done some cabaret stuff. I wrote songs for a show at the University of Chicago. I'm dabbling now a bit in pop music, but probably am not born to do that. Oh, well, yes, I wrote a mass. Some of that's on my website. There's a fair amount of choral music.
So we'll post Julian's website, and so we should share that around. Let's take one more question from somebody who hasn't asked one before, if we have one. You already asked one. Anybody else? Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. Go ahead. My mistake.
What was the racial policy in the Fred Harvey houses in terms of accommodation?
I don't...
Blacks stay there?
As far as I know, I don't know that there was any
Yes.
problem.
I can answer that. Actually, we had planned to have a talk this year. We're going to have it next year on diversity. Howard University did a project with the National Park Service on this very issue. So the interesting thing is that the Fred and the guy who was supposed to give the talk ended up not being able to come. He'll come next time. He explained a number of things. Interestingly, so the Harvey Company had a very good reputation. It did not separate seating. It did not separate housing. It's in the Green Book. So the Harvey houses that existed by the 50s are listed in the Green Books. what this gentleman told me that I was flabbergasted by was that while El Tovar was open, the Park Service didn't give up Jim Crow laws until the 1950s. So no one ever asks the question of the South Rim being a place where both there are Fred Harvey buildings and there are Park Service buildings. But the Park Service had a different idea about separate bathrooms and separate drinking fountains than the Harvey company had. That said, this all isn't well documented enough. So we have used a handful of things that we can identify that prove certain things, and the reputation of the company, not only in the white press, but in the black press. One of the most telling things is there's an article, I believe in the 1940s, where someone points out that somebody was treated badly because they were black, and how surprising that was at a Harvey restaurant. And there's a piece that I quoted in my book that Adam Clayton Powell Jr. wrote. His utter disbelief that he was on a Fred Harvey dining car, and African Americans weren't the servers, they were the managers. And he was going through Texas, and he could not believe that that was the case. So, but it's one of these things, and I do say, like, you're all here, let's try to learn more about this, because it actually is a very rich tradition, and especially the parts that overlap with the Park Service, there's information. But I think it's a really important question, because one of the things that we talk about, these guys from Howard, I just kept saying, there's like no black people in the West. You know, they were surprised at the idea that the diversity in this part of the world is about Native Americans and Hispanic people, and not as much African Americans, which they don't understand. So one of the things that they worked on is a plan to try to make it so that African Americans feel more comfortable at the Grand Canyon. So this is what we're going to talk about, one of the things we're going to talk about next year. But it's a great question. We're going to have to stop now because we have 2 more talks before the end of the day. Yeah. Julian, I want to thank you so much for sharing this piece of music. So our next speaker is Caroline Fernald, who some of you know because until very recently she was the executive director of the Millicent Rogers Museum. I actually reached out to her because I was trying to get a phone number for Maria Martinez's granddaughter. And during the course of our conversation, we talked about her own research and her dissertation, which seemed like something that would be so appropriate for this group that we invited her to come back from California, where she has a great new job running the Phoebe Hearst, is it museum or, yes. Why won't this thing close? Can you close this for me and open up Caroline's?
Is that clicker working okay?
Yeah, it is. So Caroline, come on up. Where is it? Oh, come on, really? It was here before. What? Yes, Fernald Harvey presentation 2019. That's it. Yep. Yep. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, here's the clicker if you like to
Yeah,
click.
I do like to click. Thank you. Here's on. I don't know. There it goes. It's back. I don't know. I touched it and it did that. I have a tendency to break technology, so just say goodbye to this. Just say goodbye to this computer because it's probably going to get broken. Okay, good afternoon. Hi. I'm really happy to be back in New Mexico. So yes, I just moved a little over a month ago to Berkeley. I'm now director of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, and I was really delighted to hear in the architecture panel the shout out to Julia Morgan, whose buildings are all over the UC Berkeley campus. That's right. And also designer of the Hearst Castle. So I work for the Hearst family now. I also previously worked for the Millicent Rogers Museum, and so in my move across country to Berkeley, I couldn't resist stopping for one night at El Tovar, of course. So me and my 2 grumpy cats went to the Grand Canyon. So they enjoyed the Desert View Watchtower, which looks gorgeous in its renovation, in their little cat backpacks. They didn't enjoy it as much as I did, but they have no choice. So I want to thank Stephen Fried and the New Mexico History Museum for inviting me out here for this talk. I've been dabbling in this subject for a while, currently working on a book, and it's a real honor for me to be invited to this. And I think it's really impressive that this has been going on for 10 years. It's really hard to organize an event, and to have it keep going for 10 years is really amazing, and that deserves a round of applause. So thank you, Stephen, for preaching the gospel of Fred Harvey. I was an early convert to this gospel as a student in Chicago. And so I was an undergraduate student in Chicago studying Native American art and became introduced to this very curious Fred Harvey history. And you're right, it's, not a lot of people know about it. It was sort of a byline in one of the books I was looking at that was mostly just referencing Judy Garland, not really the whole other history. When I lived in Chicago as a student, the Santa Fe building on Michigan Avenue still said Santa Fe on top of it. It now says Motorola. It's like, ugh. Yeah, exactly. Boo, Motorola. I was researching across the street roughly at the Art Institute of Chicago and became fascinated by this history. It became kind of further intrigued that so much Fred Harvey and Santa Fe Railway history and material still resides in Chicago. I mean, the Art Institute has some items, the Field Museum of Natural History, the Newberry Library especially. And so I've really enjoyed being able to go back and forth to Chicago, where I'm from, to access those materials and research them as I'm pursuing this book. But the fascination turned into a master's thesis, then turned into a PhD, and then into a museum career. And so I was just really overjoyed with my new job that I have really barely been. Yeah, I'm a seasoned Californian now, by the way. I've had a wildfire and an earthquake. So next, I just need to get taken out by a mountain lion, and I am 100%, and I live by a nature preserve, so it's really likely. Really likely that it'll happen. So I was delighted going through the Hearst Museum's collections portal, it's very sophisticated, that Phoebe Hearst herself collected Fred Harvey. And so the catalog card that you see here, it says that she picked this up. It was added to the collection in the 1920s, but Phoebe Hearst died in 1919. So I think it's much more likely that she purchased it in the Southwest from a Fred Harvey gift shop of sorts. She did travel in that area. She sponsored a lot of anthropological expeditions. But she also could have purchased it at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. Would have been quite convenient for her. And Fred Harvey had a presence there. But I just was very excited that we had some Fred Harvey things. There are quite a few, actually, in the collection that Phoebe Hearst collected herself. I just picked this one because it was the prettiest. And that's, of course, always the best distinction. My training is an art historian, so I'm kind of a usurper in the temple of anthropology. So this will be very pretty image heavy. So I hope you will indulge in that. Also, look at the price, $65. I wish. So Phoebe Hearst could have bought that anywhere. She could have bought it at the Panama Pacific Exposition. She could have bought it at a Fred Harvey House, the Indian Building, the Hopi House. She could have bought it in Chicago, and that's the thing about Fred Harvey. You got a really consistent experience at each of the Fred Harvey houses. So they really delivered on the promises that they made to their customers. So here's a picture that this was taken in the early 1900s. This is one of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe cars. And the woman whose hands are reaching out the window is very likely Virginia Couse. I had the good fortune, while I was a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, to have an internship opportunity working for the E. Irving Couse and Joseph Henry Sharp Historic Site, way up there in Taos. And I got to work with the archives at the house, the art collection, the library, and the photographs. And in this photograph, this is from a 1903 trip that the Couses took to the Grand Canyon. Couse was sent out there on the dime of the Santa Fe Railway to do some research, to do artistic studies of many of the Native American communities around the Harvey hotels and the Santa Fe Railways line, and to create some artwork promoting travel to Hopi and travel to the Grand Canyon. So they got to go to the Grand Canyon for free on their family vacation. And this is probably at the Laguna, just based on the style of the pottery that the women are selling. This is probably at Laguna in New Mexico. So House is just one of many artists who was in the employ of the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company. In fact, the two companies combined, if you're thinking of all the Anglo artists, the Native American artists, they did commission work from some Hispanic artists. If you combine all of those artists together, this is the biggest patron of American art ever, to this day. And so I think that's something that's really not celebrated or studied enough. And so that's one of the many reasons why I'm fascinated by it. But this artist here, the artist who made this piece on the left, is Elbridge Ayer Burbank. And he took advantage, like House, of the complimentary rail travel that the Santa Fe Railway provided so he could paint American Indians throughout the Southwest. He was very much like a Edward Curtis or a George Catlin character, trying to paint all of the American Indians he could find. And so the Santa Fe Railway used some of his paintings to promote travel to the area. It's too small to read, but underneath the calendar, you can see that it's the text is explaining how one would actually get to the pueblo that's being promoted here, which is Zuni Pueblo. This is a woman from Zuni Pueblo. And it gives you instructions on how to take a stagecoach from Wingate, I think. So no, it was very complicated to get to these places. So you can imagine how much more tourism really flourished in these areas as the trains got more and more sophisticated and the Fred Harvey Indian detours came to be. The painting on the right is of the artist Burbank's uncle, Edward Everett Ayer. He was one of the founders of the Field Museum in Chicago and the Newberry Library. And so not only did he have a great connection with his nephew, traveling for free on the Santa Fe Railway, collecting items for his own personal collection, which you can see is quite vast, but he also took advantage of that in growing the collections of both the Newberry and the Field Museum. So a lot of, if you look at the collections records for the Field Museum, a lot of things attributed to Ayer, Edward Everett Ayer, were actually collected by his nephew and probably directly from Fred Harvey shops. So I kind of keep tabs on the movement of these objects, and in this case, I was keeping tabs on where the Santa Fe Railway's art collection went. So, as I was beginning to do research on it, I was learning, about how they were big patrons of the arts, but where the actual paintings went was quite the mystery still. A lot of them have gone into private collections. When the Santa Fe Railway started selling off its art collection, I believe in the 1990s, if the fact-checking audience knows better, please let me know. But I believe in the 1990s, their headquarters in Chicago started selling off their art collection. And a large amount of it was purchased by the Anschutz collection in Denver, Philip Anschutz. So in this case, we have 4 different paintings by E. Irving Kaus from the Anschutz collection. You can go there to the museum. You just have to make an appointment, I believe. I don't think they keep regular hours. But in this case, we have 4 paintings by Kaus. In the upper, all 4 of these were reproduced over and over again for Santa Fe Railway advertisements. And on the upper right, this is a painting called The Weaver. This was used in a Santa Fe Railway calendar. E. Irving Kaus appeared on the Santa Fe Railway's calendars almost every year, just after that last one that you saw of Elbridge Ayer Burbank, until his death in the 1930s. I think the last one was called The Chief. On the bottom right, which is very dark, so I'll switch to the next slide, this is called Moki Snake Dance. And this was what Kaus produced when he went out to the Grand Canyon and to the communities around, the Native American communities around the Grand Canyon, was Moki Snake Dance. This piece was reproduced on Harvey Company menus. It was also reproduced in a variety of Santa Fe Railway advertisements. I think at least 55,000 copies of one of the railway's advertisements featured this painting. As a result of the promotion of using Kaus's art to promote the Santa Fe Railway and the Harvey Company, thousands of tourists flocked to see the snake dance at Hopi. And I'll do questions at the end.
No comments.
There you go. So, and yeah, unless I asked to fact check me. So this painting was used to promote the Hopi snake dance, and thousands of tourists flocked to see this dance. Very soon after this painting was completed, all tourists were banned from even going to the dance period, let alone documenting it. This piece, so this was very exciting for me in tracking down this collection of art. This piece is located at the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, or BNSF, headquarters in Fort Worth. The Fort Worth headquarters for the BNSF still have a massive collection of art, which was really great to see, as the Santa Fe Railway would decorate their railway executive offices with these original artworks, and it's still the case, only it's now at the BNSF in Fort Worth instead of Santa Fe in Chicago. So here we have the turquoise bead maker, also by E. Irving Kaus, and this was in one of the railway executives' offices. And the calendar that it was featured on, the original calendar, as well as the pump drill that it was from Kaus's personal collection. This is something that we exhibited at the Millicent Rogers Museum in a special show on beadwork. But one thing I found really great about the collection at the Kaus Sharp Historic Site is they still have all of these different props that he purchased for, like, studio props for his paintings. And so any one painting that he did for the calendars for the Santa Fe Railway, I could match up almost every single thing that the figures in the painting were wearing or touching. And so that was pretty incredible. So thinking of historic preservation and keeping things together, I think it's really amazing that a place like that still has so much of his collection intact. So getting back to this lovely photograph of the Kaus family's trip to the Grand Canyon. So some of the things that I just want to kind of talk about is this history of the Santa Fe Railway and Fred Harvey Company, how it relates to anthropology. So keeping in mind I work for an anthropology museum now, so I have to talk about anthropology and how this relates to art, but how many Native American artists responded to the influx of tourism, to the influx of anthropology in the area. So to give you a crash course, and very briefly, succinctly, crash course in anthropology, I want to talk to you about some of the dominant theories in anthropology that were influencing the collecting practices of anthropologists who were developing some of the first natural history museums in the United States, as well as how these anthropological theories and practices influenced the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railway. So beginning in the late 1800s, American anthropologists were really fascinated with American Indians. They were seen to be disappearing rapidly, largely thanks to progress like railways going through, transcontinental railways. And so anthropologists were really inspired to collect as much information and as many materials from these communities as possible. In part, they were inspired by a work by a railroad lawyer turned anthropologist. In the architecture talk, Barbara was speaking about how someone is an architect. And in the late 1800s, to be an anthropologist, you kind of just declared that you were one. There wasn't anywhere where you could go to school to become an anthropologist yet. So you just said you were. So, this lawyer turned anthropologist, Lewis Henry Morgan, he just declared himself an anthropologist one day and became very respected by other people who had also declared themselves to be anthropologists. And these are how ideas spread. So he published a book in 1877 called Ancient Society. And in Ancient Society, this became the dominant anthropological theory for decades. It inspired the way that anthropological museums were collecting and the way that they were approaching and thinking about Native Americans in the United States. So in his theory, he suggested that cultures around the world progressed through 3 different stages of development, going from savagery to barbarism to civilization. So if you can kind of imagine that this is a very racist-inspired way to think about different cultures, civilization, the only people who had attained civilization were Europeans or European Americans. So according to Lewis Henry Morgan, Native Americans had only reached barbarism and a middle stage for barbarism. And so there was going to be this, according to Morgan, an inevitable assimilation into European American culture, oftentimes through intermarriage, and that Native Americans were going to become extinct. So this really sounded the alarm for anthropological museums and anthropologists. Let me get some water. Moving from California, from northern New Mexico, it's like a badge of honor to be adapted to the elevation. And it was such an insult to me that I got here after only being gone a month, and I was already feeling like the effects of the elevation. Yeah. my voice is all dry. Okay. Well, so many of the anthropological museums, their collecting processes are built on this foundation, this theory of social evolution. So in the, like, let's say that the 1870s, the USGS, so the United States Geological Survey, they were sending out geologists and scientists out into the Southwest. In part, they were tracking what would be the best routes for a transcontinental railway. They were doing an inventory of the natural resources of the area. They were also doing an inventory of American Indians, especially the Navajo and Apache, because this was a project largely sponsored by the Department of War with the United States government. And they were discovering, and not that the American Indian people in the area didn't know about them, but they were discovering for the US government lots of different ruin sites. This is Canyon de Chelly. And doing a bit of research, you know, again, these are not actual educated anthropologists. They were doing a bit of research into the American Indians that they had encountered in the area. And as they were discovering all these different archaeological sites, they decided that there was a real urgency. So the kind of the presence of these ruin sites was inspiring them that they really needed to get as much information from existing American Indians as possible, because the ruin sites themselves kind of expedited this fear that this would all disappear. This information would be lost. So in comes John Wesley Powell. I'm partially obsessed with him. He's a very, I love this picture. He's such a grouchy man. So John Wesley, so John Wesley Powell, he's known mostly for leading an expedition as part of the Geological Survey down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon with one arm, mind you. So note that he has one arm. He lost his arm in the Civil War. And so he was in the Civil War, he led a USGS expedition, and then he was just tapped, because why not, to lead the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was under the jurisdiction of the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the purpose, the charge of the Bureau of American Ethnology was to collect as much information as possible about existing American Indians and to create and publish annual reports on these findings. So the reports themselves were hugely popular. They were, hundreds of thousands of copies were printed and distributed. Just about every library at any university has the full set, if they haven't sold them off, because they're actually really valuable now. That between 1879, when they did their first expedition and report, and 1914, over half of the BAE's reports were about the Southwest. So in part, this is because it was really easy to get to the Southwest, as opposed to other sites where there were a lot of American Indians. But also, they were selling books, and so these books were going to be flying off the shelves if they were about a subject that people really enjoyed. And it didn't hurt to also have rakish-looking figures like this, Frank Hamilton Cushing, another self-declared anthropologist, to be, you know, inspiring the women to be picking up anthropology annual reports. He's not naked, he's just mostly naked. You know, who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. You know, Frank Hamilton Cushing, in the picture on the far left, he's demonstrating how to ride a saddle, because nobody could picture that on their own. In a diaper. Yeah. I'm really obsessed with him, only partially obsessed with Frank Hamilton Cushing. Yeah, I'd have eyes for him for sure. So in the center, this is a photo of him at Zuni Pueblo. He's wearing a very interesting outfit here. So he was sent on the BAE's very first expedition into the Southwest in 1879. And they picked Zuni Pueblo first to go to. So Frank Hamilton Cushing and James and Matilda Cox Stevenson, all anthropologists, went to Zuni to collect material for the National Museum, which is now known as the Smithsonian. So thanks to the ease and the convenience of the Santa Fe Railway, they collected about 20,000 pounds of pottery, baskets, textiles, you name it, and shipped it off by freight back to Washington along the Santa Fe's route. And moved on to Hopi, where they collected about another 10,000 pounds of objects. But Frank Hamilton Cushing, because like I was saying, self-declared anthropologist, there was no actual formal process to be an anthropologist. He was making it up as he went along. He just ended up getting really lucky and being very influential to the field for decades to come. So he decided he was going to stay behind at Zuni and live with the Zuni people and learn as much as possible from them. So the outfit that he's wearing, it's a very interesting outfit, is that this is of Zuni manufacture, but he commissioned it. And he would tell people in his reports as he would go back to Washington and talk about his research at Zuni about his outfit, and that this was what the Zuni men typically wore. The Zuni people called him, in their language, many buttons, because it wasn't really what the Zuni men really wore, but it looks great on him. He looks very dashing. And then in the photo on the right, the Philadelphia connection, this is by Thomas Aiken. So Philadelphia, Thomas Aiken, there you go. They were the best of friends, and he did this portrait of him. And look on the shield. Look at the shield on the back wall. So Frank Hamilton Cushing is a very controversial figure. He lived at Zuni, he collected a lot of information, and then he very swiftly published it in a BAE report that was hugely popular. A lot of that information, though, was very protected. It was secret information. It was not meant to be shared with the public. So to this day, he is not a popular fellow at Zuni Pueblo. But the shield that you see on the back wall, this was a shield that he claims, and the validity of some of his claims are up for debate. He claims that this shield, here's a closer picture, was given to him after he was initiated into the priesthood of the bow. In order to get initiated into some of the Zuni secret societies that he became a part of, he had to produce certain things. He had to go through certain acts. One of the acts that he had to complete to be included in one of these Zuni secret societies, he had to produce a scalp, meaning he had to have killed someone and produced the scalp. His dad worked at the Mutter Museum and sent him one. So, oh. That's very nice. So the priesthood. So he says claims to have been initiated into the priesthood of the bow, and this is the shield that he says that he was given, that he reproduced in one of his BAE reports. And so he was talking about the way that anthropology and anthropological theories inspired the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company, and in turn, the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company made anthropology a lot easier to practice because of the convenience of the rail lines and the Fred Harvey Company's gift shops for collecting purposes. But looking at how specifically the Fred Harvey Company was inspired. So looking at the front of the entrance to the Alvarado Indian and Mexican building is the exact same shield. These were not produced in mass. So this is probably, almost certainly, copied directly from the Bureau of American Ethnology's second annual report, because it was so very crisply and cleanly illustrated. And so it's right there above the front entrance. And then artists like E. Irving Kaus, who worked for the Santa Fe Railway, equally as inspired, reproduced the same shield on one of his paintings. And I know for a fact that he had that port because I worked there and I went through all of his books. And that page specifically is dog-eared. So he copied that exact shield in one of his paintings. And even more so, kind of the practices of ethnography and anthropology by American anthropologists working for the BAE directly inspired the print advertisements of the Santa Fe Railway. So in this case on the far left, this is a photograph, an ethnographic portrait by John K. Hillers, who was one of the photographers for the BAE, of a Navajo man weaving. In the center, this is the print that was published in the annual report, because at the time the technology didn't really allow for direct copying of original photographs in printed materials. And then on the far right, we have that exact same image, and you can see it's the same image, especially with the striped blanket wrapped around the figure's waist. The same image, the same figure, reproduced in this California Limited Santa Fe Railway advertisement. Only the designer for the ad wanted the male figure to look more as that person would probably assume to be Indian. He's given him a headband and a long braid, but he did not miss the chance to add the Santa Fe logo into the design of the weaving. So other ways that, Kaus and Burbank, they got free rail travel. Anthropologists, I'm sure, got a deep discount to ship their freight all the way back to Washington, D.C., the part that was on the Santa Fe line. Anthropologists working in Chicago, such as George Dorsey, who was curator of anthropology, he benefited greatly from collaborating with the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railway. So the Santa Fe Railway hired him to write these sort of tourist booklets promoting the Southwest. He would wax poetic about the experience and the authenticity of the of the experiences throughout the Southwest, the items that you could purchase at the Fred Harvey gift shops and hotels. And then it would kind of give it that air of authenticity because of who he was. He was a curator of anthropology at the Field Museum. So not only was he giving it that stamp of approval, but the people who were going out to these areas to buy Native American art for themselves knew what they were getting was absolutely authentic. And so in turn, besides getting free rail travel, it made his collecting practices a lot easier. So he could quite easily collect things for the Field Museum, such as the Hopi blanket on the left. And you showed this image earlier. This is the aquatint version. So we have the Indian and Mexican building in Albuquerque, and different ways that anthropological theory and practices influence the Harvey Company can be shown here. So at the time with this Lewis Henry Morgan theory of savagery, barbarism, civilization, anthropologists in their museum displays would often show like objects together. This would show at which stage those cultures had progressed through these stages. So showing things like baskets, textiles from tribes all over the United States together. If you look in the very, very far back, I think I have a little right there. That is a Chilcot blanket, a Tlingit Chilcot blanket from the northwest coast, so Oregon, Washington area. Next to, we have Navajo textiles, and then you have some of the baskets sprinkled throughout are of Northwest Coast origin. It's just showing where these different cultures were in their progression through the social evolution. And it's very inspired by the dominant anthropological theory at the time. And speaking of Fred Harvey and the Fred Harvey houses being this experience you could always guarantee to have, you would get the exact same look and feel, same aesthetic in Albuquerque that you would get in the shop on Michigan Avenue. So that's where the Harvey gift shops on Michigan Avenue at the Santa Fe building. So almost identical in the products that are being offered and in the display. And then to give you kind of a more clear example, this is one of the World's Fair exhibits at the Anthropology building at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And again, showing like objects with other like objects in somewhat of a chaotic disorder. So we have turquoise jewelry, jewelry from all over, instruments, baskets, you name it, all over from all over the United States, which differed greatly from how anthropology museums just a few years later would start displaying their work, because the theories eventually started to shift. In this case, we have a display of katinas, many of which were probably collected from the Fred Harvey Company by George Dorsey himself at the Field Museum, a much more orderly sense of display. So as ways that these theories shifted, we have called Papa Franz to thank. This is Franz Boas. And I don't know why anthropologists are always naked in these photos, or nearly naked, but I'm sure they had their reasons. So Papa Franz, he's here demonstrating a Northwest Coast dance for what's called a life group display. So this is kind of where anthropology displays started to shift. And in this case, a life group was an arrangement of mannequins wearing the clothing that had been collected from that culture, demonstrating the mannequins, demonstrating how to use the objects that were collected from that culture, and oftentimes a backdrop painted to resemble where that culture lives. And this was how he changed the way that displays were being done at anthropology museums. I mean, he was involved in the World's Fair in Chicago. He went on to work for the Field Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Smithsonian. So he kind of was all over the field of anthropology. And also he was the first professor to be churning out professional anthropologists with degrees from Columbia. So until then, you just kind of had to say you were an anthropologist. And so the American Museum of Natural History, I have all sorts of opinions about their dated exhibition styles, but regardless, the American Museum of Natural History, which you can see an example of one of their cases on the far left, they still employ this exhibition style. This is a Franz Boas life group display of the Kwakiutl tribe out in Vancouver. And on the right, you can see 100 years prior, like this picture was taken just a couple years ago, over 100 years ago, we have the same influence being applied to the Indian building in Albuquerque. So you have Navajo weavers basically demonstrating that life group type of display. Only these are live people, not mannequins, and some tree branches added to make it look more like the natural setting of how the Navajo would typically weave outdoors. There's other ways that anthropology inspired the Santa Fe Railway's advertisements, or the expectation that tourists would have in their experience by traveling along the Santa Fe Railway. And so on the very far left, this is again another BAE photograph by John K. Hillers. And the three different positions of the Hopi girls' faces, that's called the anthropometric style, is to show the different, well, speaking of the Modern Museum skull shapes, basically of the figures. And the same sort of aesthetic is applied here in this Santa Fe Railway advertisement. And even some of the exact same features in this photograph, like the facial expression of this girl on the far left is the exact same face here. Same with this face here, represented there. And you get the hairstyle, of course, the Hopi hairstyle, and the really great, vibrant textiles. So kind of applying anthropological practices and images to Santa Fe Railway advertisements. And of course, the Indian detours would replicate a similar process. You would bring travelers, so in this case, travelers are able to experience and become anthropologists themselves with these encounters from the comfort of the back of the train car. Or in this case, you could just get in one of the Indian detours and travel directly to the pueblos with the Harvey girls. So, I love this image, it's one of the brochures, and just to, as an indulgence with the theme of this weekend, they would pick you up either at the Castaneda or the La Fonda. I just love the old photos for this. And we've got like Margaret Mead over here at San Juan Pueblo, coming straight out of the Harvey car to become an anthropologist of sorts, an anthropological tourist. And Stephen showed this image earlier, but this is the map that was included in the same brochure, showing you all the different sites that you could discover as a tourist anthropologist along the Indian detour. So talking about the different ways that American Indian communities responded to this influx of tourists, influx of anthropologists with the Santa Fe Railway and the Fred Harvey Company. So these are images coming from the National Park Service Grand Canyon's archives. We have Hopi House on the left, and the lesser known fact is that there were Navajo hogans built right next to Hopi House. And so the Harvey Company was always really adamant about authenticity and educating the tourists coming to the area. And so they added hogans nearby for the Navajo artists who were living and working there. And and that's kind of like the life group display there inside one of the hogans. And one of the first artists that they had as an artist in residence working at the Grand Canyon was, of course, Nampeo. That's her on the roof. And here on the right, kind of displaying some of her pottery that she would make. One thing that Nampeo is really well known for is she was working with BAE anthropologists and archaeologists who were uncovering pottery sherds at archaeological digs outside of Hopi. And they were coming to her to see if she could replicate some of these older designs. And so someone like Nampeo is basically taking advantage of the hard work of anthropologists and archaeologists to her advantage to make new pottery that became very successful for her. And she sold this by the hundreds at Hopi House at the Grand Canyon. Elle of Ganado, she was a really expert Navajo weaver. She was, again, another artist in residence at the Indian Building in Albuquerque, and she was featured at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, demonstrating her weaving. And so she was really using, in many ways, the Fred Harvey Company to sell work, get her name out there. And it worked well to her advantage, very mutually beneficial relationship. And you also have Maria and Julian Martinez. They also did a brief stint at the two different fairs in 1915 in San Diego and San Francisco, selling their now famous black-on-black pottery. And like Nampeo, this came out of an archaeological dig, and archaeologists coming to them, asking them if they could replicate this older process coming out of these archaeological remains being found. And it really took off, and it became hugely famous for this style of pottery. Pop Chile, Taos Pueblo painter. This is a fantastic painting that's in the collection at the Millicent Rogers Museum. And what I love about this painting, working there, is that the very back of it has the stamp from the Santa Fe Railway. This was originally on display in their Michigan Avenue building. And Pop Chile, she worked as a Pueblo ambassador for the Santa Fe Railway and would kind of explain to tourists coming to the area about the different sites that they would see, explain some of the meanings of the dances, and would do paintings also for the railway. So people would be thusly inspired to go see these things for herself. Pop Chile, however, was from Taos Pueblo, and this is a Zuni Pueblo dance. And so I think there's a little clever clever deception going on here is that she's divulging the secrets and the information about perhaps to detract people from not going to the Taos Pueblo dances that weren't people were not encouraged to go to. And Fred Cabote, so at Desert View Watchtower, Fred Cabote worked as a tour guide at the Grand Canyon, and he, inside the Desert View Watchtower, it kind of replicates what archaeologists were finding at these archaeological sites, these underground ceremonial chambers called kivas, and the paintings on the inside, and kind of replicate that same aesthetic for the Desert View Watchtower. And you'll note that our old friend here is again repeated on here, and a lot of the symbols on the walls in the Desert View Watchtower are either kind of made up or from someone else's culture. They're not from Hopi. And so again, divulging someone else's secrets because there's a little more okay that way. So there's different motivations as to why Native Americans really participated in this process, worked with the Harvey Company, and worked with the anthropologists. I mean, for one thing, it's the economic benefit. It was a swiftly changing area, and they had money to make, and this was a great way to do it. So again, mutually beneficial relationship. We also have people like Pop Chile and Fred Cabote, just maybe distracting tourists from going to their more private dances, like the snake dance at Hopi. And then we have people like Nampeo and Maria and Julian Martinez who are taking advantage fully of the discoveries that are being made and reclaiming this heritage from their own past. So one last thing in closing to kind of talk about, because I'm a huge fan, I would say I'm fangirling over this exhibit at the Poe Cultural Center, is one thing that's kind of coming as a great result of some of these various themes coming together, is that in the late 1800s, when BAE anthropologists were collecting pottery from the Pewaukee Pueblo and San Ildefonso Pueblo area, they're collecting, like I was saying earlier, tens of thousands of pounds of material and shipping it off to Washington. A lot of these pieces stayed in collection storage, very seldomly going on exhibit. So you're having the kind of cultural history and the cultural heritage of these communities taken from that community and shipped off to a museum, almost never to be seen again. So a really incredible thing that's happening right now at Pewaukee Pueblo, at the Poe Cultural Center, is the Smithsonian is collaborating with them on a long-term loan of about 100 pots that were collected in the late 1800s. So the potters there can then reconnect with their own cultural heritage. So I really love this as just sort of a way that these communities are reclaiming some of the history that, as a result of these different exchanges, was being lost. So anyway, I'm happy to take questions now. Blah, blah, blah. Who took it?
Is it on?
So there's an article in the New Mexican this morning about this, and I had to read it 3 times because the Smithsonian is now permanently loaning 100 pieces of Pueblo pottery back to New Mexico Pueblos.
Yeah. What's a permanent loan?
Well, how? Right. That's not repatriation.
It's not
so
repatriation.
It seems back-assward to me.
Yes. So I can talk to that a little bit, but it's very complex and too lengthy, so it might just be a conversation over coffee. But I would say that in 1990, legislation was passed called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So Native American human remains and associated burial items that were in museum collections, federally funded, all had to be inventoried, and any Native American community that could prove that they were descended from that, they could make a claim on those items to be repatriated. Pottery is not considered an associated remain. So that is, and the Smithsonian also, in the development of this legislation, are exempt from repatriating anything. And so it's an effort, but it's not a repatriation. So it's a permanent loan, whatever that means.
I had a question. How do the Native Americans who worked with the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad actually feel about it? I mean, and could the railroad and the Harvey Company been better in the way they dealt with the Native American artists, or was it? I mean, do you look back on it and see what they did as fair? I mean, there's so much writing in the 60s and 70s that just sort of cross-the-board blasts everything the railroad and the Harvey Company did. And, you and I have been talking about sort of a postmodern view of that. But I also kind of want to know what they could have done better, and what the Native Americans talked about with them.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things they could have done better. I mean, that's really hard to say. But there's there's different movements in the fields of history and art history and anthropology where we're kind of doing a self-evaluation. And very popular in the 1990s was the revisionist form of history. And that's where there's a lot of publications that were coming out that were really blasting and criticizing the exploitation of Native Americans that worked for the Fred Harvey Company. And since there's been a lot more work, a lot more research on this, you're getting a lot more nuance to these ideas. You're not getting this sort of it's kind of like the pendulum swung too far and the voice of authority is saying everything was bad, and then you get Native Americans whose grandmothers worked for the Harvey Company saying, my grandmother loved it. So you're getting a wide array of answers. And I think the best thing to do is to simply just ask and listen. Listen to people's opinions. Descendants whose families worked for the Fred Harvey Company may have different views than what their grandmothers had. I mean, you're going to get different opinions from everybody. There's not this unifying opinion, this unifying voice that's saying one thing. And that's what I really love about this type of work, is that there's so much more nuance, and it's complicated and it's messy, and that's what makes it interesting. So it's not just one negative look. But yes, there are many things they could have done better, yes, but it was over 100 years ago and we can't fix it now. We can do our best by doing permanent loans. It's an effort, and it's a model for other museums too.
Is there one more question before we take the next talk? Go ahead.
Don't you see a direct linkage between what the Fred Harvey Company did and the U.S. government's trading post system?
Yes, there's a direct link there, and they very much followed a similar model. More specifically, did you?
Well, I mean, the idea the Indians didn't have sources of income once they had been placed on reservations, but they could exchange barter for what they needed. What Harvey did was introduce an economic incentive where they actually could make money.
Well, exactly. But then, to go into, what could have been done better? Well, if Native Americans had never been put on reservations to begin with, they wouldn't need to be, making money. But so, yes, there's a lot of things that occurred that we can't change. The relations between the two, it was a source of income, and it's a different way to look at it is these were mutually beneficial relationships. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that this never would have had been needed if Native Americans hadn't been put on reservations.
We're going to stop there. Thank you. We have one more talk. I will say that of all the talks we've had at the Harvey weekend in all these years, this is the one that Mary Colter and the Harveys themselves would have found the most interesting. Because during their time, they lived for this. Yeah. They were really in the middle of this, and I think that we have not done a great job documenting how active they were in trying to do stuff with it. So our last talk of the day is from Kay Lauster. She and I have been having a fascinating conversation for the last couple of months. Many of you probably don't know that one of the key aspects of the Fred Harvey Company from its very beginning was that it didn't trust people they didn't want to buy stuff from purveyors. They wanted to grow their own everything and slaughter their own everything. And so Kay came to me because she wanted to see if we would let her talk about the last of the great Harvey farms in Arizona. And I encouraged her that if she wanted to talk about the last of the Harvey farms, that she also talk about the Harvey farm system a little bit in general. So I made her do some homework, which is the last thing anybody wants to do when they call and ask you if they could talk at your conference. But I hope it worked out okay. Kay is from I always get this wrong, Chino Valley Historical Society in Arizona. Mm-hmm. If you want to save the farm that she's talking about, you could do it like this weekend. So, Kay Lauster.
Thank you. So we're going to come down from the cultural talk of the architecture and the music and the art and get down to the nitty-gritty of providing food for these Fred Harvey facilities. This is a photo of the Converse family that managed the Fred Harvey farm in central Arizona for almost 30 years. But before we get to that, you probably know that Fred Harvey did a lot of traveling on the railroads doing his work for his businesses, and he ate his share of bad food and stayed in his share of flea bag hotels. And over those time periods, he developed his idea to provide good and well-prepared foods and clean, upgraded facilities. He also wanted to provide the freshest produce, milk, eggs, and other products. He often contracted with local farmers and hunters to provide foods for his facilities, eating provisions. And around the beginning of the last century, as trains moved west, he started setting up farms along the train routes to ensure availability of fresh local foods. In 1872, the Santa Fe had extended a main line from Newton to Newton, Kansas, and established its western terminal there. And Fred Harvey moved his facilities from Kansas City, Missouri to Newton around 1905, and he established a Fred Harvey farm. Here we see oh, that was an overview first. The produce building on the left, that's where they processed all the poultry. And up on the right, we see them wrangling some of the turkeys. And lower right, he had a bottling company. He produced his own brands of sodas and a lot of fruits that use real fruits and not artificial flavors. They even bottled Coca-Cola there. He had a special franchise to bottle under the name of Coca-Cola in 1914. So you see the men bottling the sodas there on the bottom right. Okay, facing this right away. Yeah, the creamery. They had about 100 dairy cattle at a farm nearby to supply the creamery. They had milk, butter, cream, buttermilk, and many other products were processed there, and they were shipped around to all the different Fred Harvey facilities. Now, the farther out that the the railroads went, the harder it became to get all this fresh and local produce. So, well, okay, let's try this one. Oh, there's the overview of the three businesses in Newton, Kansas. So this is in 1884. They got all the way out to Peach Springs, Arizona, which is west of the Grand Canyon. This is, they had a small Fred Harvey eating house here, and they also had this small dairy. I went out there about a month ago to see if I could locate the photo that we have on the left. And I went to the visitor center there, and the woman immediately recognized where's the little button here? There's a little building there on the very far right of that long string of buildings, and you'll see it over here on the right. And that long flat area there would have been the site where the dairy had been. The FFA is now using this for their farms. There's the building up close. I went and poked around there. There on the upper right photo, you'll see on the left where the fire extinguisher is. That was a framed-in room that might have been an office space. I went around to the back side, and this is looking back towards it. I don't know what the purposes were. Maybe they stored hay here. And the other building, they're still using it. The FFA kids are using this. And there you're looking right across, and you'll see there's a train going by over there. That's how close the railroad was to the dairy facility. And this is just a little bit west of the town of Peach Springs. This is all a Hualapai Indian reservation now. I tried to find information about this, but they didn't have a lot of gringo history there, just tribal history. Then in 1872, 1887, the railroad extended down through Texas to Fort Worth. And then Temple, Texas, which is about halfway between Dallas and San Antonio, they set up the Peach Tree Farm, not to be confused with the Peach Springs Farm. And they had quite a facility there. And the left is an overview of the whole farm, and on the right is the milking barns and the milking rooms. There they are milking some of their cows, the Holstein cattle that they had there. The right is a piggery, a fresh pork for the railroads. The top left is the poultry house, and the bottom left is a mule barn. So they had mules there as well. And they even had a creamery in Las Vegas, New Mexico. On the left is an image from the Historic Preservation Nomination Form. The sort of U-shaped building is a castaneda, and then the very top in the corner, in the little block space number 2013, is the creamery. And on the right is a Google map showing the same, right under the antique sign is the Castaneda, and then up at the top right where that tree is was the creamery. And they functioned there from 1921 to 1930. But back in Arizona, at the Grand Canyon, the railroad had gotten to the Grand Canyon by 1901, and with that, and with the easy access to the Grand Canyon and the water that came from Del Rio, which I'll tell you more about later, they could start expanding the Grand Canyon as a tourist site, and they built the El Tovar. And they had a small garden there and some herds there as well. But now we're going to come down to my little place in Chino Valley. This is looking north through the farm. The Del Rio farm is located in the north end of Chino Valley, which is about 25 miles north of Prescott, if anyone knows where that is. And it's on the Highway 89. It's on both sides of the highway. 89 goes from Prescott up to the Ash Fork, which is on I-40, which is about 50 miles west of Flagstaff, just so you can place this in the maps. But before we get to there's a lot of historical significance to this property before the Harvey people even got there. Arizona became a territory in February of 1863 when President Lincoln signed the Organic Act separating it from the New Mexico Territory. The initial appointment of federal officers for the area, for the new territory, was completed within a few weeks, but it wasn't until later that summer that they finally got underway. On the left, you'll see Governor Goodwin in the front center, and right is Secretary McCormick. Left of him is Joseph Allen. He has a wonderful book. He wrote back to people back east, to the newspapers back east, and there's a great accounts of the travel out here describing the landscape, trying to get up and down arroyos and rivers. It's an amazing book. U.S. Attorney General Almond Gage at top right, the U.S. Marshal Milton Duffy, and then on the left is Henry Fleury, and he was just the personal secretary to Mr. Goodwin. So the Fort Whipple was set up in 1864. Oh wait, we got to go back. Along the route, it's actually when they were here at Fort Union, they found out that they were not going to Tucson to set up the territorial capital, but they're going to go to Prescott, where there had been significant discoveries of gold. And with that Civil War had been going on, so they really needed the money from this gold discovery, so they shifted everything over to Prescott. And they needed a military post to protect the miners and to establish the territorial capital. The Surveyor General of New Mexico, along with the military escort, were sent to the diggings to determine the best place for a military post. And they chose Cienega Creek, which is, you see where the tree line is there. There was a lot of water here. It's now known as Del Rio Springs. There was abundance of grassland and water here, which is what you would need if you're coming out with all these cattle and troops. These water eventually flows to the headwater of the Verde River. Fort Whipple was established there in December of 1863, and the governor's party arrived in January of 1864. In 2014, we had a really wonderful 150th anniversary of the arrival of the governor's party. It was really quite a party we had there. So the territorial government was conducted there for 5 months until Governor Goodwin, upon exploring the area, decided the better place for the fort was on Granite Creek, near the mines in the town of Prescott that was being established nearby. In May of 1864, the fort moved to what was now Prescott, and this site, the site where the fort is now the site of our extensive VA hospital facilities. Within months of the fort moving out, 4 men filed quitclaim deeds to that tract of land situated at and near the old site of Fort Whipple. These settlers, Robert Postal, David Shivers, and several others, and their descendants have lived and farmed there throughout the 19th century. In the 1880s and 1890s, 2 railroads came through the area. The second, the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix, succeeded. It connected to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad at Ash Fork, and then they came from Prescott to Phoenix and down to the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Atlantic and Pacific was later consolidated with the Santa Fe. Here you see the water tanks on the right and some of the pumping valves that they used later on to take water from here. It was because of the coming of the railroad and the link to the Grand Canyon that the Harvey Farm became a desirable operation. In 1898, the Santa Fe Railroad, in conjunction with the Fred Harvey organization, purchased 3,250 acres of land here at Del Rio and established the dairy and poultry facilities. This is part of their ongoing plan to provide fresh local ingredients. The September 9th, 1909 edition of the Prescott paper, the Journal Minor, it reports, as soon as the land is in shape, the first consignment of dairy cattle will be placed on it, and probably that the feeding pens at Peach Springs will be abandoned. The Grand Canyon herds will come to Del Rio at practically the same time, these two stations being the most expensive points to maintain along the Santa Fe. Approximately inside of a year, at the present time, a herd of 300 Holstein cows will be on pasture at this location. By 1913, several structures had been completed at the Del Rio Ranch. The big building in the front was the bunkhouse. On the right is the old adobe house. That had been Robert Postal's home when he settled here in 1865. Beyond the rooftop of the bunkhouse, you'll see the silo for the dairy and the cow barns, and then back over the hill was the poultry farm. The ranch supplied all the milk and eggs to the Western Division of the Harvey restaurants, and it was the wintering ground for the Grand Canyon mules. But in 1924, the farm manager was Ed Waldron, and besides the dairy there, they had beef, cattle, hogs, and poultry. There were about 1,000 laying hens, and 500 acres were being cultivated for feed. The Santa Fe had acquired water rights at Del Rio Springs based on a 99-year lease from Sarah Baker, one of the original settler families. And the railroad transported the potable water from Del Rio to many locations along the railroad, from Seligman to Ash Fork to Williams and to the Grand Canyon. And with the reliable source of water, Fred Harvey and the Santa Fe Railroad could now continue their work to grow the Grand Canyon into the tourist facility they had always envisioned. So George Converse and his family came to the farm in 1926. Mr. Converse had previously worked for Fred Harvey in La Junta, Colorado, and Newton, Kansas. Here we see them at the ranch. Their son Art is on the horse on the left. There's a farmhand in the middle, and on the right is George holding the baby Jackie. Mary, who we got all these pictures from and a lot of the stories from, and her brother Gilbert and their mother Mary. And on the left you'll see the bunkhouse, the old adobe house, the silos, and the dairy. Now we're going to go up on top of those silos and look back to the north towards the farm and see the old adobe house, the bunkhouse, the mule barn, and back on the hill you'll see some little structure up there. That's where the cemetery is. And about 67 people are buried there, including a lot of the members from the Shivers family. John Shivers was the last person to be buried there in 1930. Mary remembers the funeral cortege going through. She would have just been a very small child, but she still remembers that. She remembered that. She passed away a few years ago. We were very lucky to get to know her. Now back behind us and over the hill, we're going to come to the poultry farm. And that's Mary up there on the left with her brother Gilbert. They were both born in that little house on the right. The house on the left in the basement was where they would candle the eggs and brood the chicks. And there were 3 poultry barns, Mary said, and each one had about 300 hens in it. And there's the old adobe. She called it the old adobe, so that's what I call it, the old adobe. And those boards are in front of it because when it rained, the water would go right into the house. And So they had boards there, and she mentioned sandbags. She said, oh, that's by the, you put that by the gate. So, and see that tree with that many branching trunk to it? That was a very distinctive, that's how I could locate where this was when I came back looking, because this burned down in October 1869, and what the fire didn't destroy, the water from the fire trucks pretty much took care of the rest. And this is George and Grace sitting inside the adobe. It does have really beautiful wooden beams in the ceiling, which this photo doesn't show. And here we see, top left is Judy Rojas. She's the family member we contact now since Mary has passed. She was Gilbert's daughter with her cousin Art, that was Mary's son, and in front of the bunkhouse. And on the right we see Mary Converse and her sister Myrtle cooking there in that bunkhouse. Oh, I gotta back to my pictures. Grace fed the crew in the two-story bunkhouse. They had 25 to 30 men working there from 1925 to 1933. They were putting up silage, and they always had a lot of people around. During the Depression, there were always transients coming through, sometimes 5 or 6 a day. Families traveling west to work would camp in the trees in the fields to the west. Mrs. Converse would take them sandwiches and milk. On the bottom right, we see Mary Converse on the right, her husband George peeking around, Sister Myrtle on the front, no, it's her mother on the front, Myrtle on the left, some ranch hands. At the back are Shorty Yarborough, he's chowing down there, and John Bradley, he was the trail manager at the Grand Canyon. This is a photo that to show you how tall the corn was there. George is over 6 feet tall, and he's standing on top of the tractor. And Mary was also wanting to point out that the wheels have metal cogs, and they aren't rubber tires, they're metal tires. And now we got the tractor with the rubber wheels. They 7 to 8 tons of hay a year were produced by the ranch, with half of it going to the canyon to feed the dude and working stock. At that time, about 200 acres remained in cultivation. During the war, when it's hard to get ranch hands, Mary and Gilbert worked alongside their father. Here we see Mary on the left driving the tractor. In 1945, George discovered this artesian well in the fields across the highway. And when they did that, they expanded their paying to 550 acres. They eventually were planting and irrigating more than 3,000 acres of alfalfa, averaging 4 cuttings of hay a season. Here we see them loading the mules to go back to the Grand Canyon. That's Shorty Yarborough on the left and John Bradley on the right photo. Mary said that when they brought those mules down in the fall, when they came around that last hill, they would all start braying because they were so excited knowing where they were coming. Their little winter vacation, you know. And the mother said that they were the finest string of mules you ever saw. George spent a lot of time getting them ready for the trail each season. They were beautiful when they left here. This is the only early photo we have of the dairy farm. It was a large farm, Mary said, with 200 cows, and she said the silos were of beautiful colored tiles. And I hadn't realized the significance of these photos until Mary told me that they actually raised mules there. And you'll see that the colts are mule colts. The mules turned out to be quite a big reason this farm was here. I don't think I did. Did I put that in there? I was reading something recently that said that it was a sort of funnily written article about how Fred Harvey took care of his best clients here at this farm, meaning the mules. And here we see Shorty, you'll see you're loading mules again, but they had a track that went from the dairy barn, it's still there, goes from the dairy barn to the milk processing building. And you'll see that little square inset, there was a scar there from where there used to be a porch. And you'll also notice the roof line. This is a north-south facing roof line, and in a minute you're going to see an older version of this that had a different roof line to it. But first we're going to see George Converse on his horse by the mule barn. And some of the fields to the left where the transients would camp. And this is a whole field of sunflowers, so you have to imagine that all golden yellow. And there are the kids, Jackie and Mary and Gilbert with one of the colts. And this is some of the scenes of their childhood growing up on the farm. I think they had quite an idyllic time growing up there. You see on the left Mary and right Gilbert are getting a little bit older here. Oh, there's the older photo up on the left. Even the back, you'll see they have a whole horse and wagon there. And the screen porch that Mary mentioned, and now the roof line is going east-west, but it still has the track going out there. I think this picture on the right should illustrate a book. It's just perfect. And there's Shorty Yarborough and George Converse with that's a Sharford bull. That's a cross between a Charolais and a Hereford. And that was a prized cattle that they had there. Here we do some roping there. I haven't found information about the beef production, but they certainly did have beef cattle here. It might have been a feedlot, but Mary mentioned that. The left one is Mr. Converse roping, and on the right is Mr. Shirley from the canyon. And Mary says, "This is Mr. Shirley walking away, letting his horse do all the work." And the fellow in the white shirt and tie, that was what Mary calls an officer from Chicago, had come to check out he's sitting with the ranch hand checking out the cattle. Here we are sorting cattle, doing some branding. In the middle photo, there's Gilbert and Mary and her dad branding the cattle. In the background is Mr. What did I just say? Mr. Shirley and Mr. Tyson. During the war, when beef was rationed, they grew 5,000 turkeys on the farm. And you see, go back to that photo in Newton, Kansas, where they're unloading those turkeys to process them. I don't think they processed them here. I don't think that they had the space for that. But the top left is Mr. Tyson. I don't believe he's related to the Tyson poultry people today. But and then on the right are Mary and her dads. Now Mary's getting even older. And this is we're going to end with the Converse portion of the story here, with the young family standing in front of the grape arbor. The kids did most of their growing up here. And the Harvey farm closed in 1956. The Converse family moved to the Grand Canyon, where he continued to work for Fred Harvey until he retired in 1965. So now we're going to move to what it looks like today. If you're standing at the highway, looking east, you'll see the dairy barn in the middle. On the right is the barn where they were doing all the wrangling of the cattle in front of. To the left of the dairy barn is the milk processing room, and then the bunkhouse is sort of in those trees on the left. And then we go right from there to the red barns or the poultry barns, and the two little houses up on the hill are the ones where Mary lived when she was a child. And those what the poultry barns look like today. There's not much left of them. The houses, though, have been well maintained. This is leased to one of our local long-term ranching family, the Wellses, and he maintains these and rents these out. And again, the house on the left is where they candled the eggs. And now we're moving north towards those are the barns where they were wrangling the cattle. And then north of that is the dairy barn. And you can see the top left photo was from when I first started going out there, and the one on the right is more recent. And you can see that's sort of been deteriorating. The paint's getting worse. The roofing's coming off. The fellow who's the land manager for this has been trying to get the owners to give us some money, just keep them maintained, but they haven't been interested, so they just are deteriorating. And this is the inside of the dairy barn. You'll see the tracks going to the dairy. But Bill Otwell, our preservation architect in Prescott, he came and toured these buildings with us, and he says this building is still in very, very good shape and very solid. All these buildings were. he was really pleased to see that. Oh, this is a lineup of the dairy barn, the milk processing room, and the bunkhouse. And there's those tracks going to the milk from the barn, and you see the silos are gone, and there would have been a big one there on the right. And inside, that room, this room with the red thing standing in it, that was an insulated room for refrigeration. And on the right is some of the office space. They would have done work there for running the farm. The bunkhouse, the siding is starting to fall off of that. But in this house, Bill Otwell went open and closed the door, and he just went, "This house is still perfectly square." He said, well, the railroad built them, so they are really very well built. And the mule barn, inside the mule barns, he said these are identical to the ones at the canyon, a bit smaller, but the structural is very similar to the ones at the canyon. This is on the south side. On the north side, there were these various rooms. And then you're looking out the north side, and they had those larger doors, maybe bringing stuff in and out. Just now, then we get to the equipment barn, and George Converse built that in 1945. And we're going to walk on out to the cemetery, and this is what we often see when we walk out to the cemetery. This is about the friendliest bull you would ever meet. We have come within 30 feet of him, and he just sort of yawns and walks away from us. And I bring people out there, and they're like, "Oh, it's okay." He's really doesn't look it, but he really is. And there's the cemetery looking back towards the house. A lot of the Shivers family graves are there. Family members often come, get in touch with me, and we take them out there, show them the farm, show them the grave sites. It's very nice to meet them. And now back at the bunkhouse, you'll see the tree with the odd-shaped branching, and that's how I could spot the house. And then you'll see the cement sidewalks going to the house. And up on top of the hill is a small 3-room pit house above the cemetery, and you'll see the lineup of the bunkhouse, the dairy, and so forth, and a nice granite mountain in the background. Where are we now? Since, let's see, so Fred Harvey sold the property and it was owned by several land development companies. In 1964, Buford Yarborough bought it. He was a prominent local rancher. And then in 1978, James Bond bought it. He renamed it the 007 Ranch. He branded all the cows 007, and he had a trucking company, and he changed the AAC number, that's a trucking company number, to 007 as well. So his son says we ran our cows 007 and our trucks 007. So they sold it in 2004, and it's been owned by a couple of different development companies since then. But the most recent owners have been 2 former Microsoft employees, Bob O'Rear, he's a Microsoft employee number 7, and Jim Brown. But most recently, we saw this big land for sale sign, which is what inspired me to come and let you know about this place. Because I've got a copy of the prospectus. No, they have a copy of the prospectus here. I have it with me if anybody wants to see more details. And here's a map of what the plan is for it. On the right up in here, is up there is where the farm is, and the purple and blue are commercial. All the gold is kind of higher density housing. On the left is lower density farm housing, and in the middle is Highway 89 going north and south, and all the green are the wetlands and the streams. There's a lot of wetlands there, actually. It would be a really sad thing to see this thing bulldozed down, but I think that is what's going to happen to it if nobody steps forward to save it. And one reason I wanted to let you all know about this, because I don't think anybody knows this place exists, and it is a true Fred Harvey facility. And I don't know, the prospectus says that they will take offers for some or all the property. I don't know how much they'd be willing to chunk out, and I don't know what kind of proposal we could give to them to try to preserve this property that would make it desirable for them. We probably wouldn't want to get the whole property, but if we get some of it, we would have to leave it so there was enough for the other, so they left value for the rest of the property, is what I'm trying to say. So this historic ranch contributes to Fred Harvey history, railroad history, the Grand Canyon history, because of the link between the farm and the railroad and the Grand Canyon. And this is the only surviving nearly complete Harvey farm. And we're all interested in saving cool Harvey places, so I didn't know if we could drum up any interest and try to save this place. What do you think?
Do we have questions for Kay?
Do you know when it was the Fred Harvey farm, what other properties besides the Grand Canyon it supplied specifically? And I'm selfishly asking about La Posada.
It did supply all the Fred Harvey facilities from Santa Fe West. So, yeah.
And the dining cars.
And dining cars, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, they did. They owned them and developed them. They built them. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they owned it for a long time. I mean, generations of people worked at these different farms in Temple, in Newton, and the Peach Springs was especially because before there was a train line to the Grand Canyon, that's where you took the wagon train or a horse ride to the Grand Canyon. That was like the tourist place in the 1890s before there was a train. Other questions? Yes.
We've been having trouble getting on the property anymore. We used to, but the man who's sort of running it now never answers his emails or his texts anymore. So we have trouble. Oh, you can see it from the highway, and there's one road that's sort of their driveway in. You can go a little ways in and look at it, and they're just renters there now, so no one's really policing it. I don't usually go past that main driveway without permission, though.
Any other questions? Yes.
Fred Harvey also owned a bunch of big ranches in Colorado
Yeah.
and Kansas that raised a lot of cattle, and they had to move out of Kansas because the farmers, all their livestock were going on the farm. Whatever happened to those ranches?
It was actually only one ranch. It moved. So it was originally in Kansas. I was always touched because it was in Holcomb, Kansas, where the In Cold Blood murders were. So when we went to visit, I thought it was a very cool and literary thing. But the farmers hated, you know the song from Oklahoma, the farmers and the ranchers can be friends? Well, in Kansas, the farmers and the ranchers were not friends. And they basically forced the Fred Harvey farm out of Kansas into Colorado. So Fred Harvey invested in that farm in part to make money. Those cattle were sent back for slaughter, but they weren't really for the company. I mean, Fred Harvey bought his meat from the slaughterhouses in Chicago and in Kansas City when Kansas City developed them. That ranch was built, interestingly, this is how you understand how Fred Harvey worked. So Fred Harvey was a mid-level executive, and he bought those ranches with the president and vice president of the railroad so that they could make a lot of money when he bought them out. So it was land that was adjacent to the railroad tracks, so they had grazing rights that came with their land grants. But this was one of the ways, something that's really interesting when you dig into the Harvey Company, you see what their businesses were like. It was really about bringing people together for different things that they would profit from, and this is some of the earliest stuff. And in fact, the paperwork for all this is here in the museum. Daggett Harvey donated the scrapbook that shows the sales of all these things. So it's actually a very cool collection that you can really see why Fred did it, and then how he made sure his bosses made a lot of money right at the right time as his company was expanding. Are there any other questions? Yes.
For those of us that were younger, mentioned meat rationing. Was that to divert to the troops? Is that why that was occurring? Can you explain why during the Depression, through the war years, meat was rationed?
Yes, meat was rationed during the Second World War, and so people ate turkey and ate different things because the meat.
Was that because they were giving the beef to the soldiers?
Oh, of course. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And of course, the Harvey Company was hugely involved in the war efforts. One of the things that we have shortages of are research on the Second World War and their involvement, but almost nothing on the First World War. But we know that the Harvey Company was equally involved in the First World War. Ford Harvey was in charge of the National Red Cross, and they nationalized the trains during the First World War, and the Ford Harvey ran the food service on all the trains. But oddly, we know very little about this, but it's like a dissertation, you know, kind of waiting to happen. Are there any other, one more question? Yes, that line, well, I think Daggett is already probably going to dinner, but yeah, that town was named after the Daggets. The Harveys married the Daggett family, who were a very well-to-do family in California. And so Daggett is named for Helen Daggett, and so is that, you know, a lot of the, you know, when you get to name all the towns your train, you know, your railroad gets. So a lot of them are, you know, people that they knew. So we're going to stop for today. I want to say thank you for a great day.